Settle in as we explore witchcraft in the Middle Ages through 5 quiet comments, brief windows into fear, faith, and everyday life. Comment your location and your current local time below so we know where and when you're watching. If this gentle walk through history speaks to you, a like and a subscribe would be appreciated. If you had asked someone in Elizabethan England to explain what witchcraft was, you would have received an answer both plain and urgent. Picture a low-ceilinged room warmed by a single fire, the hush of a household broken only by the creak of beams and the soft clink of pottery. An older woman, her hands stained from work and weathered by wind and washing, leans forward and speaks in the clear, matter-of-fact voice people use when naming danger, because naming it makes it feel smaller. She would tell you, without hesitation, that witchcraft is the secret art of harming by hidden means, the touch of a glance, a whispered charm that brings fever, a curse that sours milk or blights the crops. For her, it is not idle superstition, but the language people use to explain misfortunes that have no obvious cause. Hold that image like a print in the mind, a woodcut, or a rough drawing of the witch's Sabbath, and you can hear how it settles into everyday talk. In the picture, shadowed figures huddle beneath a gibbous moon, bent and eager. A black cat slips between them like a hush. A bubbling pot breathes steam that hangs over the clearing as if it were a spell. Folks in town and village point to such scenes when they speak of pacts and secret meetings. The picture gives shape to an anxiety that follows them home, the sense that unseen forces can gather in the dark to conspire against the living. Sermons from the pulpit, tales told by hearthlight, and rumors passed through market stalls all fold that picture into how people make sense of bad luck. Misfortune becomes suspect not because it is mysterious, but because the image supplies a plausible hand to blame. Human malice, aided by unholy means. So the story told over and over becomes part of how a community interprets the world. In those conversations, fear sits beside a kind of hard, practical logic. Neighbors trade the names of those who took different paths, who lived too near the greenwood, who mended a broken bone with an odd herb. There is genuine pity for the elderly, a wary distrust of the outspoken, and a fierce hunger for explanation when a child falls ill or a well runs dry. Saying witchcraft is a way to locate the cause and to begin thinking about a remedy. To an Elizabethan ear, the word carries the weight of the unknown and the human need to make it knowable. The image of the witch's Sabbath lingers in the mind, half nightmare, half moral lesson, and shapes how people look at one another in a world where luck and danger are felt as plainly as the wind. When most of us picture a witch, we see a single terrible image. A woman in league with the devil, meeting in a coven, flying on a broomstick, performing satanic rites, making human sacrifice, and hurling curses from a shadowed wood. The image is so vivid it feels ancient and obvious. The black-robed inquisitor, the pamphlet that turns rumor into law, the pyre crackling at the village edge. But that neat, terrifying portrait was not handed down unchanged from the beginnings of Christianity. It is the result of centuries of shifting beliefs, debates, and anxieties, a story that grew and hardened over time, rather than a fixed truth from the first days of the faith. Imagine the first Christians moving through a world that already teemed with magic and miracle. Healers and enchanters walked the lanes. Omens were read in animal entrails. Charms were tucked beneath threshold stones. The Hebrew scriptures and the Greco-Roman traditions carried their own warnings and prohibitions about sorcery and divination, but responses were far from uniform. Some pastors and bishops denounced certain practices. Others treated them as folk medicine, superstition, or illusion, strange things to be corrected by preaching rather than crimes to be punished by fire. Through the long medieval centuries that ambiguity remained, church councils and popular belief often pulled in different directions. At times, authoritative clerics wrote stern tomes about the danger of the devil and urged vigilance. At other times, pastoral letters and penitential manuals counseled forgiveness and penance for those accused of strange arts, or explained nocturnal visions and supposed flights with theological caveats or weary skepticism. Clergy would sometimes interpret alleged witchcraft as diabolical camouflage for illness and misfortune. Other times, they dismissed it as fantasy, error, or madness, a mistake of the mind more than an act of sacrilege. Then, toward the end of the 15th century, something shifted. In 1486, two Dominican inquisitors penned a short, sharp book intended as a practical manual, the Malleus Maleficarum. With a mix of theology, law, and lurid anecdote, they insisted that witches were not merely deluded or dangerous in a vague way, but consciously conspiratorial, in deliberate union with the devil. The manual justified prosecution, spelled out methods for interrogation, and offered judges and magistrates a way to turn rumor into legal action. It did not merely describe an existing belief so much as shape and amplify it, giving a vocabulary and a rationale that could be used, and was used across the continent. After the Malleus, the discourse hardened. Over the next centuries, especially through the 1500s and 1600s, Europe reframed witchcraft through the pressures of war, plague, economic stress, and religious conflict. The Reformation and the Catholic response tore at old certainties and left communities jittery and suspicious of internal enemies. When a crop failed, or a child fell ill, or long-running feuds flared, it became easier for anxious neighbors and fearful magistrates to reach for a human cause. A witch who had chosen evil, signed a pact, and sent malign forces against them. Courts that might once have treated such accusations as curiosities began to treat them as capital crimes. Inquisitions and secular tribunals drew on manuals and on popular testimony. Confessions, often extracted under threat or torture, confirmed the narratives interrogators demanded. That transformation did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not sweep uniformly. In some regions, cautious judges slowed the pulse of persecution. In others, zealotry spread with devastating speed. But a pattern emerged with grim regularity. The victims were disproportionately women, older, vulnerable, socially marginal, whose ordinary lives could be reinterpreted as evidence of malice. A sudden illness might be blamed on a squinting neighbor, a child's fever explained by an accusing look. The Malleus and the legal culture it inspired supplied a grammar for every petty hatred and every grievous misfortune to be read as proof of witchcraft. Slowly, the old, messy world of tolerated superstition, pastoral care, and local custom was eclipsed by a newer, more lethal definition: witchcraft as deliberate devil worship and treason against God and society. So when we summon the image of the witch as diabolical conspirator, we are remembering a story that gathered force centuries after the birth of Christianity. The association of witchcraft with the devil and with treason was forged in a particular historical moment and shaped by specific writings, legal institutions, and social crises. Ink on a pamphlet, the seal of a magistrate, the ritual of a court. These things turned vague fear into enforceable crime. Rumor became verdict. Individual suffering became a pattern that stretched across villages and decades. That awareness does nothing to lessen the horror of what followed. Seeing witch persecutions as a development in a long, tangled human story does not excuse the pyres, the forced confessions, the ruined lives. What it does offer is a quiet, exacting lesson. Definitions of sin and crime are not immutable. They can be made, remade, and writ into law. And when they are, the consequences can burn as surely as any flame. If you had tried to describe a witch in the terms we now use to someone living in 1300, they would have been utterly shocked. The idea would have sounded unfamiliar, even mad, far from the everyday stories of cunning neighbors or folk healers they already knew. What we call the witch was not an ancient fixed figure that everyone always recognized. It was a new shape that crept into being over centuries. born in the cool shadows of cathedrals and the smoke of burnt villages, and by the end of the Middle Ages had become something both terrifying and unmistakable. Picture Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, fields giving way to bustling towns, markets full of a babel of tongues, and old feudal ties loosening even as new authorities struggled to hold the world together with laws and sermons. Then imagine the shock of catastrophe, most of all the Black Death between 1347 and 1351, when parishes emptied, crops failed, and the countryside looked like a land mourning itself. When death arrived with such speed and little explanation, people hunted for causes they could point to. Misfortune, grief, and fear needed a face. For long stretches of the Middle Ages, the Church treated harmful magic mainly as maleficium, the small earthly injuries done by envious neighbors, curses, poisoning, charms. Texts like the Canon Episcopi even warned clergy that many nocturnal visions were illusions and urged caution. But as the medieval world convulsed, learned men began to stitch those old folk fears into a darker theological cloth. By the 15th century, a new vocabulary, packed with Satan, Sabbat, flight by night, a conspiracy of the damned, entered sermons and treatises. These were not yet fireside gossip, but the work of theologians and inquisitors trying to explain suffering in moral and cosmic terms. Certain books carried those ideas with unusual force. Johannes Nieder's Formicarius, written in the 1430s, gathered stories of witchcraft and temptation and presented them as part of a system, a moral manual that moved accusation from isolated incidents toward a coherent portrait of witches as seducers and enemies of God. The Church itself took steps. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, acknowledging diabolical witchcraft and empowering inquisitors. 2 years later, the Malleus Maleficarum appeared, a virulent and painstakingly argued manual, insisting that witchcraft was an enormous threat and urging zealous prosecution. The combined authority of these texts hardened a suspicion that had been growing. Witches were not merely troublesome neighbors, but conspirators in cosmic rebellion. These were learned men's ideas, but they did not stay shut in cloisters. Gutenberg's press, spreading through Europe in the mid-15th century, turned what had been academic debate into pamphlets, sermons, and household rumor. What was once slow, local talk could now be copied, shipped, and read by many. Courts and inquisitors, armed with theological justifications and new legal procedures, also learned how to extract confessions, interrogation, the threat and frequent use of torture, and incentives such as promises of absolution for informants. The legal imagination adopted the language of conspiracy and pact, and the machinery of law began to treat suspected witches as members of a hidden diabolical network. The charges were not neutral, and the story quickly took on a distinctly gendered face. Women became the primary figures in this new category for many practical and bitter reasons. Marginal members of society, widows scraping by, herbal healers with practical knowledge, or women involved in local disputes, were visible targets when a community needed someone to blame for drought, infant death, or a blighted harvest. Long-standing misogynies found theological backing in manuals that read Eve's transgression as emblematic of female weakness before the devil. Slowly, suspicion hardened into a script. Witches were overwhelmingly women, and female bodies and social roles were made into signs of spiritual danger. The emergence of the witch was not just a misogynistic fantasy, it was also a political and social response to change. States were centralizing power, courts were seeking new forms of control, and communities felt the strain of shifts in labor, land, and authority. The story of the witch offered a simple narrative for a complicated world. Obey the Lord, attend Mass, live as you should, or be vulnerable to a neighbor's secret arts. Accusation became a way to repair a world that felt broken, a ritual of naming betrayal and restoring order through blame. By the end of the 15th century, something striking had happened. The patchwork of local beliefs about harmful magic, charms, and cunning folk had been distilled into a single, horrifying image: a woman in league with demonic forces. This invention was legal, theological, printed, and popular all at once. It was taught in universities and preached from pulpits. It comforted those who needed an answer for misfortune, and it endangered those who fit the new silhouette of guilt. The figure of the witch had been built piece by painful piece by writers, jurists, priests, and anxious neighbors. That does not mean belief in harmful magic was entirely new. People had always lived with charms, fears, and suspicions. The crucial change was that, in the late Middle Ages, a specific, systematic, and diabolical figure came fully into being. It was a slow, social invention, an edifice of thought and law and rumor, and once fashioned, it cast a long shadow. The witch conceived in those centuries did not vanish with the dawn of the early modern age. She went on to shape trials, executions, and literature for generations to come. What is a witch? Close your eyes and let the phrase roll slowly off the tongue. For many, an image arrives at once: a hunched figure bent over a steaming cauldron, a crooked nose catching the moon, or a woman in a pointed hat, broom poised above a thatched village, black cat weaving through root-bound ankles. Those are the pictures children draw and carnival masks sell, the glittering shorthand of a long popular imagination. But across the centuries, the word has worn many faces. In a late medieval village, a witch might be the woman who knew which herbs would calm a fever or ease childbirth, whose calloused hands mixed salves and charms with an intimate knowledge of bodies and soil. To a magistrate in an early modern town, shaped by sermons and fears about salvation, a witch was cast very differently, as a conspirator with the devil, an apostate whose small transgressions threatened the spiritual order. In a year of plague or failed harvest, witch could become the name given to the apparent architect of misfortune, the neighbor who had argued with the baker, the midwife who had lost a child, the solitary figure who gathered roots at the hedgerow. These meanings braided together: folk knowledge and learned demonology, grief and envy, practical medicine and misogyny. Then, in 1487, a book called the Malleus Maleficarum helped harden one of those strands into something dangerously fixed. Written by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, it declared witchcraft not superstition, but deliberate diabolical conspiracy. Its pages were a manual for judges, how to recognize, interrogate, and punish. It traveled through courtrooms and parishes, giving form and confidence to suspicions already born in rumor and pain. Over the next 2 centuries, accusations spread in waves. These were not tidy legal cases so much as human dramas charged with fear. When crops failed, when infant mortality rose, when a sudden illness took several neighbors, people reached for explanations. And sometimes those explanations needed a face to blame. Trials could be theatrical and terrible. Hours turned into long nights of questioning. Pressure was applied until confessions were wrung out. Accusations were hurled like stones, ricocheting through families and streets. Across regions and decades, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, were punished or executed. Disproportionately women, many elderly, many poor, many outspoken, many midwives and herbalists, many who simply did not fit communal expectations. Not every hunt looked the same. In England, some accusations were handled with local bluntness. In New England, the year 1692 in Salem stands out for fevered fits, spectral evidence, and the hanging of 19 people, one man even pressed to death under a pile of stones. In the mid-17th century, a man named Matthew Hopkins styled himself Witchfinder General and organized raids across eastern England, leaving communities scarred. In parts of continental Europe, especially the German lands and the borderlands of France and Switzerland, Entire districts were convulsed by trials. Old grievances, religious splits, and wartime anxieties turned neighbors into prosecutors, and the ordinary into the extraordinary. To hear these histories is to listen for ordinary lives interrupted. Picture a cottage where a practical woman stacks pots by the hearth. Later, when the child down the lane falls ill and the apothecary cannot save him, the same woman is whispered about. Imagine a frightened child giving testimony before a bench of men in robes, that small voice magnified by adults desperate to be rid of fear. Picture a household stripped of dignity as neighbors gather, eyes bright with the thrill of communal drama, while the accused sits bound and shivering under heavy suspicion. At the same time, another tradition ran quietly through daily life. The cunning folk, the wise women and men who healed wounds, foretold weather, and read fortunes. They were practical resources, beloved, sometimes resented. Their skills could comfort a village, but knowledge without institutional protection could be recast as malice when luck turned bad. The very craft that made them valuable could also make them vulnerable. Religion and politics sharpened the blade. The Reformation and the Counter-Reformation fractured Christendom, and where authority felt threatened, religious leaders and civic powers sometimes harnessed witchcraft accusations to reassert control. Sermons fanned fears of invisible conspiracies. Pamphlets and manuals fed the machinery of prosecution. But other quieter motives mattered too. Envy, property disputes, and rigid gender norms. A woman who would not be corralled by expectation could find gossip hardening into evidence. The familiar symbols we still carry, the cat at a witch's heel, the broom poised for flight, the pointed hat, come from a tangle of folklore, satire, and later popular culture. They tell us more about the imagination that came to dominate our memory than about the lived reality of most accused people. By the later 17th and 18th centuries, attitudes began to change. Enlightenment skepticism, shifting medical knowledge, and legal reforms made the old spectacles of trial less acceptable. Accusation gave way to other explanations for misfortune, and historians started to sift these stories again, asking what the campaigns had meant for families, for communities, and for the ways societies control what they call abnormal. If you ask today what a witch is, the answer depends on who answers. A figure of myth and nightmare, a scapegoat for collective fear, a healer whose craft embarrassed patriarchal order, or a literary emblem of forbidden knowledge and independence. Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the label witch tells us less about metaphysical reality than about a society's anxieties. It reveals what a community needed to believe to make sense of suffering and whom it could sacrifice in the telling. So when you picture a witch, let that image be complicated. See the healer at a window, lantern trembling in the rain. Hear the clatter of robes on cold stone as a trial begins. Remember the hush of a village after an execution, the way ordinary life resumes even as something profound and unjust has been done. What remains is not a single face, but the echo of countless lives, and a lesson in how fear and power can remake the human image into a monster, until we choose to look harder and tell the fuller story. Your first thought would probably be of an older woman, perhaps a hag, someone who keeps to herself in a crooked cottage, needing privacy to practice her dark arts. Images rush in: black magic, devil worship, covens and black sabbaths, the familiar companions, black cats and broomsticks, and darker suggestions of human sacrifice and orgies. It's a picture made of fear and rumor, a single, sensational costume stitched from countless whispers. Picture now a single, unmistakable figure framed against the village green, bent and secretive, fingers threaded with herbs and talismans, eyes that some claim can rend the weather or the body with a look. That particular portrait, the look, the trappings, the motives and the dread she inspires, had been carefully formed in the public imagination by Elizabethan times. and in many ways it survives today. The image is so familiar that we rarely pause to think how many steps it took to become fixed in people's minds. Walk back 3 centuries to the year 1300, and the scene is oddly different. Stroll the same lanes, and you won't find that single shadow waiting in the hedgerows. The specific figure we now call the witch simply doesn't exist as a settled idea. There is no shared catalog of signs or powers. Instead, beliefs and fears are local and scattered, expressed in 100 separate ways, shaped by village, sermon, and family rumor. Between those distant years, between 1300 and 1500, something slow and remarkable happens. Over 2 crucial centuries, through countless conversations, pulpit warnings, fears muttered by candlelight, and the steady reshaping of stories, the notion of the witch is slowly invented. It is not the sudden birth of a monster, but an accretion. Details gather like dust on an old book until a shape becomes clear as people point and give it a name. What emerges is a coherent figure ready-made for the stage, for the law, and for the imagination of later generations, a creation born as much from social need and shared anxiety as from superstition, a new lens through which entire communities learn to explain misfortune and menace. Imagine a village at the turn of the 14th century, the year 1300 sketched in the margins of a chronicle, but felt more clearly in the cracked hands of farmers and the lean flanks of their plow horses. The air hangs heavy with wood smoke and the sweet tang of herbs that dry from rafters like tiny pennants. In kitchens and at crossroads, under the church tower and beside a slow river, ordinary people carry practical knowledge of things unseen, roots and stones, charms murmured at a birth, words to still a fevered child or coax rain from a stubborn sky. That everyday habit of calling on small powers and small arts is what men and women of this time mean when they speak of witchcraft and sorcery. This idea is not a neat bookish definition. It's a patchwork sewn into daily life over generations. Recipes and rites handed down from parents and neighbors, half-remembered lore kept by local healers, gestures and names brought home by travelers. Each household stitches the pieces a little differently. For some families, the same woman who blesses a cow also knows the herb for a persistent cough. For others, the man who mends a cracked bone with splints and poultices is equally likely to break a charm or read the moon signs. The skills blend and overlap until it is hard to say where medicine ends and magic begins. Because the idea of a witch is loose and composite, it takes different shapes depending on where you stand. It is not a singular, sinister figure lying just beyond the hedgerow. Instead, it is a shifting presence in village life, someone to consult in sickness, a person whose reputation inspires caution, respect, or sometimes envy. The same hand that soothes can, if crossed, be thought capable of harm. That possibility breeds prudence rather than wholesale panic. People live with this double edge of help and threat as part of the ordinary balance of community life. Importantly, the lurid images we later associate with witch trials, devilish marks on the body, secret nocturnal gatherings called Black Sabbaths, orgiastic rites of infernal allegiance, are not part of this world yet. Those later terrors will be invented and exaggerated in other centuries. In 1300, villagers do not habitually look for branded signs or tell stories of infernal conspiracies. The fears and fantasies that drive later persecutions simply haven't hardened into a single narrative. Religion and folk practice sit in a complicated intimacy. Clergy and laity often treat certain practices with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, but the everyday relationship is not one of total hostility. Priests might frown at some charms. Parishioners might quietly combine a prayer with an older spell. The default is not to equate all magic with diabolic allegiance. Instead, spiritual belief and practical arts weave together in ways that can be uneasy, but also cooperative. Nor is witchcraft a gendered thing. When someone whispers that another can read the future in a bowl of water, or knows the right herb for a stubborn cough, They are thinking as likely of a man as of a woman. Men and women both serve as keepers of local knowledge. Skill and reputation, not sex, usually determine who is sought when trouble comes. The moral weight attached to these acts is lighter and more ambiguous than later portrayals would suggest. Working a charm can be an act of protection, a craft of survival, as likely to soothe as to harm. So listen to the sounds of that time. The rasp of a knife on bark as a healer strips a root, the murmur of a prayer and a spell braided together, the measured tread of someone hurrying to a sickbed, the lowing of a cow at dusk, and the distant toll of the church bell. In 1300, witchcraft is not a single, terrible accusation, but an everyday presence, a field of knowledge people turn to with a mixture of hope, unease, and pragmatic acceptance. Throughout the Middle Ages, it might surprise you to learn, very few people were actively persecuted as witches. The numbers were vanishingly small compared with the great witch hunts that would explode in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Yet beneath that seeming calm lay a steady current of worry and warning, drawn in part from the oldest pages of Scripture. Some passages of the Bible read like the cold edge of a law, phrases that come down from an earlier world with a firmness that allows no argument. From the Torah's ancient codes through the voices of the prophets and the books of wisdom, the sacred texts speak plainly about the realm of the unseen. They warn again and again, do not call on spirits, do not seek omens, do not practice sorcery. These injunctions are not passing remarks, but repeated cautions, settling into the text like bedrock, blunt, uncompromising, and meant to be remembered. Imagine a reader in a dim chapel or a small private chamber, a shaft of light picking out the worn letters as their finger traces the line. For people living with the constant anxiety of harvests, sickness, and childbirth, these were not abstract lines of theology, but commands that touched everyday life. The words implied punishments and prohibitions. They demanded that communities preserve a particular holiness by rejecting any arts that looked like a conspiracy with powers outside God's care. They did not catalog every fear or motive, but they drew a boundary and required obedience. When those Hebrew and Greek lines were carried into Latin and then into the vernaculars, translators did more than copy sounds. They made choices that shaped how whole communities would understand them. In monasteries and scriptoria, by candlelight, copyists bent over vellum and ink, their quills scratching in the hush. The Latin words they chose, and then the phrases put into local tongues, could tilt a passage one way or another. A single verb might turn a forbidden practice into a legal crime. A different noun could make it seem a moral failing or merely a superstitious error. These were not academic debates. The language chosen by copyists and translators echoed in sermons and household talk, and in the minds of judges and magistrates who had to sort right from wrong in the life of the village. Picture a parishioner listening as the priest reads aloud at Mass. The congregation already knows the old stories. They know the tone and the weight those words have carried through generations. In that half-dark, under the smell of tallow and old wood, the passages reach beyond the book and knit religious conscience together with civic expectation. For a medieval ear trained by liturgy and homily, these prohibitions were not abstract philosophy, but concrete guidance, a clear signal that certain practices were forbidden, untrustworthy, and dangerous to the fabric of a community life. That movement from text to everyday rule was never straightforward. Translations and local customs produced a range of resonances. In some renderings, the emphasis fell on the illicit use of knowledge, arts that claimed to manipulate God's world. In others, the focus was moral. People who relied on secret arts instead of trusting divine providence were seen as corrupt. The result was a tapestry of meanings, every thread tugging at how a community might respond when it feared unseen powers at work around them. Through all this variety, one through line remained. The Bible contained firm prescriptions, and those commands, carried across languages and centuries, entered the medieval imagination with an authority that could harden into law, sermon, or social practice. Those stern lines lingered like a refrain. In the hush of manuscript rooms and the murmur of parish churches, in the quiet decisions of magistrates and the whispered warnings of neighbors, those ancient prohibitions continued to shape how whole communities understood the boundary between what was sacred and what was forbidden. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. The words come like a cold wind through the tents, brief and absolute. You shall not practice augury or witchcraft. They are spare, almost unadorned, the sort of law that sits like flint in a palm, small, hard, and meant to strike fire into a life that needs reshaping. Picture the scene behind that single sentence. A vast camp spreads across stony ground beneath a mountain whose peak still exhales smoke. Smoke and incense mingle with the scent of baking bread and the sharp tang of sweat. At the center stands the man who has been walking between God and his people for months, Moses, holding laws meant to bind a fragile, newly freed nation together. Around him are faces browned by sun and wind, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and wonder, children half asleep against their mothers' shoulders, elders who remember bondage and now must learn the difficult discipline of freedom. This law is not an abstract clause for scribes. It lands in that breathing human circle and touches the needs of everyday life. To forbid augury and witchcraft is to refuse anything that would displace the people's dependence on the one God who has brought them here. Augury, reading signs in the flight of birds, the entrails of animals, the casting of lots, and witchcraft, invoking spirits, concocting charms, seeking advantage through hidden arts, were common in the lands around them. Such practices promised control, secret knowledge, a shortcut when the path seemed impossible. For a people newly delivered but still vulnerable, those promises could be irresistible. The command cuts them off. These are not tools for your future. They are incursions of other powers into the life of the covenant. Listen for the weight behind the brevity. That single line protects a fragile trust. Judgment, guidance, and safety belong to God alone, not to manipulations of fate or the occult. It aims to keep the community from being hollowed out by fear and divided by loyalties to foreign powers. It is meant as a safeguard for the vulnerable, who might otherwise be preyed on by those offering false hope and counterfeit rights in moments of grief and uncertainty. So the law stands stark and memorable, a small sentence inside an enormous conversation between a people and their maker. It is a boundary set in language as sharp as any stone. Do not seek hidden wisdom in forbidden places. Do not barter your allegiance for the illusion of control. In the long shadow of that prohibition, the people are asked to learn a different way. They are asked to be sustained not by secret arts, but by covenant faithfulness, by the visible, sometimes harsh, but honest demands of a community bound to one another and to the God who speaks plainly from the mountaintop. That plainness is itself a kind of shelter, a steady voice instead of whispers, a law that shapes a people capable of bearing freedom without collapsing into fear or superstition. Leviticus 19:26. Listen, in the steady voice of an ancient law, there is no room for doubt. It is declared plainly and without compromise, not a casual warning, but a statute meant to stand at the center of a people's life. These words are carved into the moral shape of a community that measures itself by covenant and command, and they mark a line that must not be crossed. Picture the scroll unrolled in the dim glow of an assembly tent, the inked letters trembling across the palms of a priest who reads not for curiosity, but for the sake of order and survival. Around him, a congregation leans forward, faces cut in shadow by the lamplight, carrying the weight of remembered history, the long wanderings, the fresh memory of temptations, the constant warnings against the gods and practices of neighboring peoples. Over and over, they had been urged to be set apart, to let their holiness be seen in separation. The law's harshness lands immediately, not as cruelty for its own sake, but as a firm boundary against powers thought to threaten the fragile trust between them and their God. To be called a medium, to summon or harbor a familiar spirit, was to reach for powers that lay outside the covenant. Such things could not be tolerated in the midst of the camp. The consequence the law names is absolute. The verdict hangs in the air like a weight, death, each syllable falling like iron. Hear the hush that follows. It is not only the silence of shock, but the silence of a people reminded how delicate their world is, how quickly the ties of faith and community might fray. The command functions both as a boundary and as a voice, stern, protective, final. It insists that some breaches are not private failings, but public dangers. Read that way. The law is not a dusty footnote, but a living force that shaped daily behavior, held families to account, and kept, in the severe language of the time, the covenant whole. Those words endured, carried forward in memory and recital. A man or a woman who is a medium or who has familiar spirits shall surely be put to death. Spoken once and repeated through the years, they echo into centuries as a window onto a world where the sacred and the social were inseparable, and where preserving one demanded an uncompromising pronouncement of the other. Leviticus 20:27. But the lines you hear about witches and witchcraft did not arrive in English ears out of nowhere. They came wrapped in the language of the Bible. For English speakers, the sacred text was not a distant Latin or Hebrew authority kept for scholars. It became a living book, spoken from pulpits and read in courtrooms. And the particular words people heard, the rhythms and phrases that lodged in common speech and law, were shaped most decisively in the early 17th century, when King James's translation set the tone for generations. Picture the scene. It is the early 1600s. Europe is full of anxious people. A storm that wrecks a ship is read as a warning from heaven. An illness or a sudden death stirs rumor, and the fear of evil forces sits close to the hearth. Into this climate comes a newly commissioned translation of the Bible, begun by royal order in 1604 and finished in 1611. The King James Bible did not drop from the sky. It was the work of committees of learned men meeting in halls at Westminster, Cambridge, and Oxford. Some 47 scholars in all, each steeped in Hebrew, Greek, classical rhetoric, and law. They worked by candlelight, comparing earlier English versions with the original tongues, choosing words that would sound authoritative when read aloud in parish churches and private homes. Those translators aimed not only to convey meaning, but to shape cadence and clarity, and their choices mattered. When the Hebrew text named practices or persons difficult to pin down in modern terms, the English words they picked became the terms of common understanding. Exodus and Leviticus, the books that set out ancient prohibitions, were read in vocabulary ordinary people heard every Sunday. Phrases like, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," did not appear in isolation on a page. They were carried on the voices of ministers, repeated by magistrates, and woven into the rhetoric that could justify suspicion and prosecution. King James himself was no neutral patron. Years before he commissioned the translation he had written on the thing he feared most. His pamphlet, Daemonology, first printed in 1597 and republished when he became King of England, shows how obsessed he was. He had personal experience with witch trials in Scotland in the 1590s, the North Berwick cases, where violent storms and political unrest were blamed on conspiracies of witchcraft, allegedly aimed at his life and his voyage. Those events shaped his mind and, by extension, helped set the cultural tone for the new century. So the Bible's language and the anxieties of the age met in a decisive way. The King James Bible did not invent witchcraft accusations, but it furnished a powerful and resonant vocabulary that both fueled belief and lent authority to action. When a minister read that translation in a parish church, its phrasing felt final, a divine prohibition rendered in clear English that people could not dismiss as mere foreign law or scholastic quibbling. For ordinary folk, the Bible in their own tongue was law, moral guide, and the voice through which communities judged what was natural and what was unnatural. Imagine a village at dusk. The church bell has long stopped tolling, candles gutter on kitchen tables, and neighbors whisper about a woman who keeps to herself while her neighbor's cattle fall ill. When a magistrate quotes the scriptures in the market square, he draws on the same familiar textual music that every worshiper knows. That shared language does more than describe. It acts. It supplies the word that names an enemy, witch, and hands that name to the machinery of the law. This is not a tale of a single cause or a single villain, but of how language and power fit together at a fraught moment. The English voice of the Bible, shaped and sealed around 1611, entered a world already inclined to see invisible threats. King James's own writings and his response to witch trials fed those anxieties, and the translation's eloquent, authoritative wording gave them a ready script. In the fevered decades of the early modern witch hunts, the translator's choices became part of the cultural fabric against which suspicion hardened into accusation and accusation into prosecution. So when we cite references to witches and witchcraft, we are not pointing to abstract relics of distant texts. We are listening to living echoes of English translations, most powerfully the King James Bible, spoken at the height of the witch hunts, shaping how a nation read its sacred law and acted upon it. The words themselves carried weight. They became the language by which communities named danger and all too often decided who would live and who would die. In the Latin translation that shaped medieval minds, you won't find the English word witch. Instead, the translators used maleficos, a term that points specifically to practitioners of harmful magic, not to a broad category of witches as we imagine them today. That subtle difference in wording mattered. It narrowed the focus to acts considered dangerous or malicious, rather than naming an entire group or cult. Picture a dim room lit by a single guttering candle, where scriptures are read aloud and the air is heavy with dust and the metallic tang of old ink. In those settings, people turn pages and listen for authority, and one clear fact stands out from those pages. Nowhere in the Bible is there an explicit account tying witches to an organized Satanist cult. The ancient laws and narratives condemn sorcery, divination, and certain occult practices, words written in Hebrew and Greek that later generations translated as witch or sorcerer. But they do not lay out a conspiracy of devil worshippers meeting in secret. Over the centuries, however, different hands began to stitch new patterns onto those older threads. Preachers, scribes, and frightened communities took the biblical prohibitions and embroidered them with stories of demons, pacts, and secret rites. Folktales and moral panics amplified small fears into sweeping accusations. What began as targeted warnings against harmful magic was gradually transformed into broader tales of malign conspiracies. That later picture is not the plain statement of the biblical books, but a human overlay, a layering of anxiety, interpretation, and imagination. Recognizing that distinction lets us read those old texts with steadier eyes, separating the original words from the fevered shadows that later fear cast across them. For most of the Middle Ages, the official church position was clear. Sorcery and witchcraft were to be discouraged, but they were not, in themselves, judged inherently evil, and they did not, as a rule, call for frantic persecution. That careful distinction shaped how people lived and how clergy tended their flocks, even as the line between prayer and practice often blurred. Step into a market town, and the life of that distinction unfolds in scent, sound, and small gestures. Wood smoke curls from a backhouse. Wet wool clings to a merchant's cloak. A smith's hammer throws off a metallic tang, and beneath it all is the constant murmur of remedies and warnings. At a stall by the inn, an old woman shakes herbs from a leather satchel, naming each one like a litany. In a narrow lane, a mother presses a folded scrap of paper to her baby's chest and whispers a charm learned from her mother. On the cathedral hill, bells toll for Mass, and are also rung to keep off thunder and plague. In the cloister, a monk. Quill paused, copies a salve recipe into the margin of a theological text. Magic and medicine, prayer and craft. These things braided together so easily that people rarely separated them. Illness and misfortune opened the door to every kind of help. A fever burned, a child would not sleep, and a folk reached for whatever comfort worked. A poultice of crushed roots, the name of a saint whispered over cloth, a small charm sewn into a garment, or a reading from the stars. Charms and amulets, scraps of scripture folded into lead, a little iron cross, a sling of herbs on a belt, were as ordinary as the wooden rosary beads that clacked in a devout hand. Travelers pinned metal badges from shrines to their cloaks. Relics stored in stone chests were treated with a reverent confidence that the sacred could touch the everyday. People prayed with one hand and reached for a talisman with the other because both offered hope. Clergy and laity moved in that same wide current of belief, and the church's response was often practical rather than purely doctrinal. Bishops and parish priests condemned what they judged dangerous, invocations meant to summon demons, rites intended to harm a neighbor, but they were also guardians of people who needed protection. A priest might denounce a pernicious spell from the pulpit and still bless a field before sowing, sprinkle holy water at a sick child's bedside, or authorize an exorcism when fear of demonic influence took hold of a village. Rituals that mixed prayer, gesture, and sensible things, salt, blessed oil, bell ringing, were tolerated because they offered visible aid and fit into the church's language of sin, salvation, and protection. Monasteries and cathedral schools preserved and passed on much of the knowledge people relied on. In manuscript-filled scriptoriums, monks copied not only scripture, but herbals, medical remedies, and notes on the stars. The same hand that painted an illuminated gospel initial might transcribe a list of simples for treating wounds or a note about planetary influences on the body. Learned physicians drew from classical authorities and from this practical lore. Courts and kings consulted astrologers to pick auspicious dates. That meant magic could mean high learning, astrology, alchemy, the manipulation of nature's secrets, while elsewhere it described the domestic arts of the wise woman who treated cuts with comfrey and hummed a lullaby that also served as protection. The popular healers, the cunning folk, wise women, and village practitioners moved quietly through everyday life, binding wounds, setting bones, and removing curses. Their tools were rarely mysterious for long. A charm sewn into a cradle, plantain on a sting, a whispered name said 3 times to cool a fever. They earned authority through memory and reputation. Neighbors rewarded them with eggs and butter, and when a physician's remedies failed, entire households turned to these healers. Calling their work magic is true, but it misses how ordinary and practical it felt to those seeking relief. Tension and fear flared when misfortune clustered. Livestock fell ill, children died, a sudden blight arrived. Fingers pointed and suspicion spread. Clerical warnings about harmful witchcraft increased after such shocks, and some priests even wrote guidebooks for colleagues on dealing with possession or maleficium. Yet the church often preferred pastoral remedies, confession, penance, communal prayer, and chastisement rather than mass arrests. Exorcisms were dramatic and ceremonial, but their purpose was to protect, to restore soul and body to the parish fold. When practices crossed into what was judged deliberate harm, ecclesiastical authorities might step in, but their usual aim was spiritual correction and preserving social order as much as punishment. The landscape of faith and fear was painted in many shades. A pilgrim kneeling before a relic prayed for a cure. A farmer rang bells at dusk to keep lightning away. A midwife tucked a blessed scrap of text among her instruments to guard a birthing mother. Men and women balanced hope with resourcefulness, fear with devotion. Popular practices and institutional religion often overlapped. Sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they clashed, but more often they worked together to protect families and communities. Listen to the creak of a village gate, and you hear history made intimate, the rustle of herbs in a pouch, the scrape of a monk's quill, the hush of a whispered prayer. Magic in its many guises was woven into daily survival, and the church, for all its doctrinal concerns, usually met that weaving with a practical hand, disciplined where it feared harm, endorsed where it brought comfort, and shaped practice into patterns that held communities together. In that careful balance of fear and care, the Middle Ages appear not as an age of uniform superstition, but as a world where belief and common sense found countless ways to shelter the human heart. If the early medieval church had decided to put everyone who dabbled in magic to death, the result would have been a bloodbath. Such a policy would not only have filled the courts with bodies, it would have turned entire pagan communities, the very people missionaries were trying to win, against the faith. Conversion, the clergy knew, could not be forced by terror without destroying the fragile hope of change. So when priests and bishops stood before their congregations, their voices steady beneath carved rafters and the thin light of beeswax candles, they spoke of magic with a weary, deliberate impatience that felt both pastoral and doctrinal. In those dim spaces, where the smell of tallow met the murmur of wool-clad bodies, magic was not treated as a rival power worthy of respect. It was named instead as a species of error, an old superstition that drew the curious and the frightened into foolish practices. The tone they chose was not triumphal, but corrective, like the way someone today might calmly point out that a sleight of hand trick is not proof of supernatural force. Their reasoning was simple and hard-edged. Miracles, grace, and truth came from God. Any claim to bend the world outside that divinely sanctioned order could not, by definition, be of God. When charms were offered, whispered formulas repeated, light seemed to move, or fortunes were foretold, the clergy did not credit those phenomena as evidence of a competing deity. They explained them as signs of deception, products of imagination, suggestion, or misread signs, rather than proof of a hidden hostile power. This account let them hold a difficult nuance with what might be called stern compassion. The people who practiced or sought out magic were not automatically cast as apostates or secret worshippers of evil. Often they were simply misled, prey to a longing for control in a precarious world, to anxieties they could not name, or to customs that had become habit. The possibility of demonic deception was acknowledged, and it was unsettling, but it was named as a reason for pity and correction, not for instant condemnation. A frightened mother clutching an amulet, or a man who had turned to charms after a bad harvest, could be seen as someone in error, rather than a willing convert to the Prince of Darkness. So sermons held two edges at once, rebuke and reassurance. The priest urged his flock away from charms and incantations not with a triumphant smirk, but with the conviction that truth deserved patient instruction. He reminded them that to seek God honestly was the only sure remedy, and that those who strayed into superstition needed guidance, not the assumption of diabolical devotion. In that careful casting, the church framed magic as a misguided detour, misleading and dangerous, to be corrected by teaching and mercy rather than punished as if it were, in itself, a mortal act of rebellion. For most of the Middle Ages, the practice of magic was usually read as a symptom rather than a sin, a sign of lingering pagan ways or drifting from the true faith. The solution, from the church's point of view, was straightforward: root out paganism and heresy. Official teaching settled on a curious judgment. Those who dabbled in charms and whispered spells were often labeled delusional or foolish, not inherently evil. Their errors were seen as spiritual sickness that needed correction more than demon hunting. Picture a cold village evening to understand how that teaching landed in people's lives. Smoke from the hearth threads into the dark, a child coughs in a shadowed bed, and an old woman stirs a pot of herbs by lamplight while neighbors lean in and whisper because they have no better explanation for misfortune. The church's presence is never truly distant, heard in the heavy tolling of the bell, felt in the measured cadence of a sermon, and written in doctrine that laid out what was fitting for a Christian soul. In cloister and pulpit, in the prayers uttered at dawn and vespers, magic is named, judged, and warned against. Yet this was not a world of ceaseless crusade. There was no steady dragnet hauling every talisman into the light, no constant parade of tribunals to inspect every whispered charm. The church drew clear boundaries and spoke of spiritual peril, but it did not always marshal armies to pursue every supposed offender. Life continued, a mixture of fear and stubborn hope, priests urging care for souls, healers tending fevered bodies, and neighbors striking small bargains between caution and need. The result was an uneasy, almost musical tension, equal parts condemnation and practical restraint, played out in candlelit kitchens and at the church door. Doctrine and devotion met the everyday demands of survival, and the people who lived between those worlds learned, by necessity, to negotiate a fragile balance, to heed the warnings of faith while reaching for any comfort that might keep a child alive through the night. In the hush of a candlelit chapel or under the wind-bent thatch of a village house, people lived surrounded by powers they could not fully see. But medieval minds did not sweep every strange thing into one category. Sudden healings at an altar, the strange comfort that lifted a weary soul, the soft glow that seemed to settle over a shrine. Those were not called magic, nor were the visions that seared themselves onto a monk's memory, or the trembling certainty of a prophecy that helped guide a whole community. Whether whispered in prayer or carried in procession as a holy relic, these gifts were understood as coming from God, interventions meant to teach, to console, to steer the faithful. At the same time, other powers made people uneasy. The line between a divine sign and illicit sorcery was rarely steady. A woman who claimed to read the future with herbs could be hailed by some as a comforter and cursed by others as a corrupter. An object that stopped a fever in one house might be suspected of causing it in the next. Even practices that sit on the edge, astrological charts read by candlelight, charms tucked into a child's cradle, could be praised as wisdom by one neighbor and feared as maleficence by another. Clerics and lay people, scholars and neighbors, argued in low voices about intent, origin, and authority, whether a thing bore heaven's imprimatur or the taint of something darker. In that uncertain space, everyday life vibrated with wonder and suspicion. Devotion and doubt lived side by side, like two candles on a windowsill flickering in the same breeze. People watched for signs and asked questions, not only about what had happened, but about who had made it happen, and why. The answer was never simple. What counted as magic stayed elusive and shifting, as unpredictable and alive as the flame on a votive candle, throwing shadows that looked different to every eye. Astrology provides a kind of divination, an augury not unlike prophecy. So is it sorcery or witchcraft? Or is it instead another gift from God? The question hangs between skepticism and faith, and it is easier to answer if we first slow down and look up. Imagine a hand pressed to a cool stone, a face tilted into a bowl of black. Around the hush of sleeping villages and the last embers of a dying fire, tiny lights begin to show. They are not random pinpricks, but patterns, lines and gatherings, constellations that seem to speak. To sit beneath that page of sky and trace those lines is to practice a kind of listening, an attentive staring that waits until the heavens put words together. Think, too, of those lights as workmanship, the deliberate craft of something beyond us. When people call the stars the work of God, they are not speaking only in poetry, but in a reverent belief that the vault above was arranged with purpose. The brilliance that spills across a winter night, The slow procession of planets against a velvet backdrop, the sudden bloom of a comet. Each feels like evidence of design, as if the sky were a cathedral ceiling painted with meaning meant to be read. Astrology then presents itself as the human attempt to read that handwriting. The astrologer is not a charlatan or a sorcerer in this view, but a patient reader, someone who matches motions above to currents below. They watch the slow, stately arcs and try to discern what these movements might suggest about harvests and wandering fortunes, about births and deaths. It is a craft born of humility as much as curiosity. Humility before a cosmos that feels alive. Curiosity about how human life might be mirrored by celestial motion. There is an intimacy to the work. Each reading is a small, trembling bridge between two orders. The hard, immediate world underfoot with its griefs and joys, and the vast, steady choreography overhead. Whether the result is called prediction, counsel, or prayer, the act looks the same. Eyes lifted, breath stilled. A desire to hear what the heavens, created and meaningful, might yet reveal about the days to come. Certainly, many people in medieval Europe believed so. If you were lucky enough to attend university, you'd certainly be taught astrology as part of your education. But away from the lecture halls, in the narrow lanes and thatched yards, knowledge lived in hands and voices as much as in books. In the gray light before dawn, when mist clung to the hedgerows and the first cocks tested the morning, villagers gathered in small knots by the hearth or under eaves to speak of remedies and rites. A woman bound a poultice with careful fingers. A midwife murmured a lullaby that held an old cadence of blessing. A neighbor whispered instructions about a herb that eased a fever. These were everyday acts of tending, practical, hopeful, and born of necessity. To patch a wound, to ease a cough, to sprinkle water on a furrow and speak for rain, such deeds kept a fragile life going in a world that demanded constant coaxing. There was an instinctive distinction in people's minds between spells that helped and those that hurt. When words, gestures, or concoctions bent toward mending broken bodies, calling in a lean harvest, or driving away pestilence, they were understood as benign. A mother pressing herb to a brow, a farmer calling for sun on a late spring, these were not feared. They were acts of care, performed in the light of experience and the fierce tenderness that binds communities together. But the same imagination that produced remedies could also twist them into something darker. Intent mattered. The same charm used to bless a field, if braided with malice, could become a weapon aimed at a neighbor's lambs or a family's crop. What had been medicine could become menace. People watched for that shift with a hard, wary eye, because harm was not judged by tools alone, by words, herbs, signs, but by the hunger behind them. To medieval folk, that darker strand had a name, Maleficent. It marked a moral line and a social alarm. Those suspected of turning art into injury were branded maleficos, an epithet that carried weight and danger. Being called maleficos meant you might be watched, feared, and kept at a distance. It could change how you were treated at the common table and how the community kept its secrets. For those who lived it, this was not abstract theory. The healers and the midwives worked amid gratitude and obligations. The accused felt the cold stare of neighbors who feared both misfortune and one another. Magic was woven into the moral fabric of everyday life. When it served to heal and sustain, it was ordinary and kindly. When it was turned to harm, it became maleficent, and the one who wielded it was marked apart. That line between blessing and curse could mean welcome, and it could mean exile. In the slow light of dawn, when smoke still rose from clay chimneys and village dogs answered one another in baying echoes, people moved through a world threaded with more than the visible. They plucked thyme and rue from hedgerows, not just for their scent, but because leaves to them carried a language of cure and protection. They braided hair and tied knots, murmured charms as they bound a child to a cradle, and folded small gestures of hope into the ordinary motions of a day. Magic, then, was not some hidden trade kept behind closed doors. It was part of the air people breathed, habits and hopes woven into daily life. Walk through a medieval market, and you could see that variety on every stall. A woman selling cheese might also offer red thread and rosemary, sprinkling a pinch of crushed herb and a brief prayer to keep cattle from wasting away. Nearby, a scholar in a cathedral town bent over planetary tables and charts, tracing the slow paths of the stars and calculating the moments when heaven, in theory, lent its influence to medicine or marriage. In cottage and cloister, in town and manor, talismans and amulets sat beside charms and long-remembered folk remedies. Learned rituals from Latin books rubbed shoulders with simple gestures passed down through families. These practices did not form a single, uniform belief in the unreal. Each had its own logic and its own face. The wise woman might draw a circle of salt and sing an old song over a fevered child, relying on careful observation, recipes remembered by heart, and the trust of her neighbors. Her power came from experience and community, from what had worked before. In another house, a lay person might hang an image of a saint, whisper a prayer, and tuck a small relic into a bundle, an act of devotion that, for them, was inseparable from protection. In a candlelit study, a learned man could consult the stars, a grimoire, and the commentary of ancient authorities trying to bend cosmic correspondences toward a specific purpose. Same word, magic, different sources, aims, and rules. The language used to talk about these things could be sacred and profane at once. Latin prayers might sit beside a lowly rhyme meant to staunch a wound. A physician's recipe could sound indistinguishable from a charm when the same words pass between neighbors. Many practices openly invoked God and saints. Others called on old folk names or the unseen patterns of nature. Social meaning shifted with circumstance. A midwife's careful manipulations could be praised as skill when a mother survived, yet viewed with suspicion if a woman died, or if motives were questioned. What helped one day could condemn the next. That ambiguity made magic a charged presence in daily life. It comforted and it alarmed. It healed and sometimes bewildered. People turned to rituals not only out of blind superstition, but because those rituals made life bearable. They gave a shape to grief, a procedure for hope, a small sphere of control when harvests failed and disease struck without warning, a poultice crushed from herbs, an arranged moment calculated by the stars, a stitched charm tucked into a breviary. Each was an attempt to explain misfortune, and if possible, to alter it. Institutions and authorities reacted in varied ways. Some practices were woven into accepted religious life. Others met skepticism or outright censure. The lines between pious ritual and illicit art were rarely sharp. Clerics, nobles, merchants, and peasants alike engaged with these currents, sometimes simultaneously. A charm inscribed with a saint's name could serve as a bridge between popular piety and a deeper theological world, while those steeped in learned cosmologies treated magic as a study of natural forces, a way of deciphering a divinely ordered universe. What matters most in imagining that time is not a single picture of uniform darkness, pierced by occasional sparks of superstition, but the sense of a living, many-voiced culture. The practices were as diverse as the people who practiced them. The healer who mixed poultices and prayers, the astrologer who read the sky as one reads a book, the farmer who left offerings in the field to coax a good yield, the patient who kept a written charm folded in a breviary. Each act answered a human need, for health, for security, for explanation, and each bore the stamp of its maker's understanding and belief. And in the hush of evening, when lamps shivered against stone and the day's work was counted, those practices persisted. The air smelled of smoke and drying herbs. Ink dried on leaves as low prayers and whispered charms drifted from open doorways. People lived as if the unseen could be shaped by purpose and ritual, by word and touch. That, more than any single doctrine, is the truer image of medieval magic, a tapestry of lives, each trying in its own way to reach beyond the seen and to make sense of a precarious, often beautiful world. Some within the literate elite took magic as seriously as any learned craft. Their shelves held grimoires and codices, collections of medieval and classical spells and rituals that required careful reading and steady hands. During the Crusades, these collections grew stranger still. Manuscripts and techniques arrived from the Middle East, folded into the same pages that taught names and gestures, seals and salts. For these men and women, magic was not folk rumor or rumpled superstition. It was a discipline learned from books, practiced with the same exacting attention a scribe gave to ink. On certain nights, when lamps guttered and cold pressed at the shutters, a small company of practitioners would gather. They drew their geometry on the floor, chalks that described angles, salt that marked borders, and arranged herbs and candles until the air tasted of smoke and crushed leaves. A low murmur rose and fell, voices reciting syllables passed down from hand to hand. The cadence was not a hymn, but a kind of trained precision, each voice fitting its place like a tool in a hand. These gatherings were not for prayer, they were exercises in calling, binding, and command. When the presence came, it made itself known in ways that unsettled the bones, a chill that brushed the neck, a shadow that pooled at the edge of the circle, a pressure that turned the breath shallow. No one in the ring crossed themselves or bowed. They leaned forward. The center of the rite became a contest of wills, the atmosphere taut as a surgeon's operating room. A leader, steady with repetition, would issue the calibrated words that transformed disturbance into servitude. What emerged often defied easy naming. It bent to the lines drawn around it as if the chalk and salt were a harness. To outsiders, it might look like blasphemy. To those inside, it was, emphatically, mastery. They insisted, again and again, in public squares and in the private rooms where magistrates and priests pressed them, that what they did was not devil worship. In their mouths, the denial was almost stubborn pride. Worship, they argued, required adoration, a turning of the heart toward another. Their rites were the opposite. The thing summoned was addressed, named, and compelled. It received no altar, no offering of the soul. It was a force like wind or current, to be invoked and made accountable, turned to a purpose without devotion. Nor did they rest on semantics alone. Their defense reached into ethics. The power they wielded was a means, not an end. They spoke plainly to common folk. This magic served the living. It was turned outward, used against hunger, pestilence, and the cruelties of fortune. To them, conjoining with dangerous forces for the relief of human suffering could not be equated with evil. The old division between sacred and profane, they said, bent under the weight of practical good. Intent and outcome changed the moral geometry of what was done. Critics were never silenced. Some watched with contempt and fear, convinced that any command of demons amounted to surrender to darkness. Others, more curious or more desperate, listened when the practitioners described their discipline of control, rules, safeguards, strict boundaries around what might be commanded and what must never be asked. Those debates were fierce and real, not mere rhetoric. Arguments about power and trust, about where humanity ought to draw its lines, and what risks could be taken in a world that did not easily forgive failure. So the rites continued, alternately feared and sought, condemned by some and defended by others who believed in the righteousness of the aim. Each ceremony reinforced the same premise. Mastery, not homage, defined their relation to the beings they called. When the outcome eased a mother's famine or stilled the fever of a child, the means, however morally suspect to some, was recast as necessity and compassion. That argument held weight in the hush after the last words were spoken and the chalk was swept away. When the circle broke, those who had stood within it emerged exhausted and resolute. They carried with them a kind of weary honesty, convinced they had done what needed to be done, and aware, as always, that the world would judge them harshly. They walked back into streets that whispered of blasphemy and salvation in the same breath, knowing that to walk where others feared to look was to accept both the gratitude of the saved and the scorn of the fearful. But the kind of magic practiced by illiterate commoners was different. It was an oral tradition, passed down family to family and hamlet to hamlet, a body of small practices that fit into the rhythms of daily life. Charms and herbal remedies, blessings for the harvest, fertility rites and the like belong to the same world as the midwives and plowmen. Practical acts, learned by watching and repeating, treated as part of local custom rather than a secret art. Imagine the half-light of a stone chapel, candles pooling honey-colored light on scratched oak and vellum. A scholar leans close to a book, finger tracing a passage about the hidden virtues of plants and the regular motions of the heavens. Now step outside the town walls to a low, thatch-roofed cottage where an old woman works by hearth glow, mixing a bitter draught and pressing a small charm into a fevered child's palm. The two scenes belong to the same landscape, the learned study and the kitchen hearth, both looking to the same remedies and signs for guidance. To the people who moved between those places, magic was not a single sinister thing, but a cluster of practices and beliefs woven into everyday life. It was intelligible and often morally neutral, a means to mend, to predict, to comfort. A charm might stop bleeding. An astrologer might be consulted to pick the right day to sow seed. These were services offered in market squares and in courtly chambers alike, sometimes given freely, sometimes charged for, sometimes sought out of hope, and sometimes out of fear. That did not mean medieval society was without debate. Learned clerics and lay students argued over whether the power of the stars, the curative force of herbs, and the crafts of astrologers or alchemists were part of God's ordered creation, a kind of applied knowledge, or whether they opened a door to something darker. Rumors, anxiety, and the occasional scandal sharpened suspicion and made communities wary, but suspicion did not automatically become condemnation. For most of the medieval era, using a charm to staunch a wound or consulting the heavens about sowing did not brand a person as wicked or a servant of the devil. The shift came slowly. A tightening of catechism here, a growing climate of fear there, a hardening of terms that, over time, edged some practices into the same shadow as heresy in the popular imagination. Through the long Middle Ages, the hidden arts lived in a gray world, part craft, part faith, part fear, and only rarely during that span were they immediately equated with devil worship. People continued to go to scholars and to wise women alike, seeking remedies, explanations, and comfort, moving through a world where practical necessity and spiritual unease coexisted in close, complicated company. Long before the fearful image of a woman at a cauldron or a shadowy figure muttering charms captured the imaginations of townsfolk, a different terror threaded itself through the hearts of bishops and parish priests. In the great stone cathedrals and the low, smoke-stained chapels, men who measured the world in sacraments and scripture watched a slow, corrosive whisper with the same dread a mason feels for a crack in a load-bearing wall. To them, the danger was not a flash of sorcery at the edge of town, but something that could work its way inward, unseen and patient. Heresy, in their eyes, was not merely a mistaken thought. It was a betrayal of the single roadmap to salvation, a crack in the communal mirror that reflected Christ to his people. A witch's deed could be pointed to, isolated, and punished as an aberration. A heterodox idea, by contrast, could slip into sermons, be repeated at hearths, and be copied into new hands. That kind of spread looked to churchmen like contagion. One doubt might breed another, and before long whole neighborhoods could be looking away from the doctrines that held them together. Picture a bishop bent over his desk late into the night, the flicker of a taper throwing long shadows across parchments he had read since youth. He carried responsibility not only for liturgy and lands, but for the salvation of countless souls. When doctrine drifted, it was not an abstract worry, but a danger that might consign the faithful to perdition. In villages, priests who catechized children and heard confessions feared the subtle rot of heterodox teaching the way a farmer fears blight across his wheat. For ordinary believers, the stakes were intimate and enormous. Certainty about God's truth decided more than debate. It decided what came after death. And in a precarious world, that certainty was a basic comfort. So the church arrayed itself against that enemy of the mind. Councils were summoned, sermons sharpened into warnings, and the communal machinery of belief, rituals, creeds, the steady rhythms of the liturgical year, was reinforced to guard against doubt. These moves were both pastoral and political, meant to reassure anxious souls, to instruct, and to draw congregations back into the fold. Yet behind those measures lay a grimmer fear that a single new idea spoken in the wrong place might set whole communities adrift. What emerges is not a picture of an institution merely terrified of the supernatural in every form, but of one wrestling with an internal peril. Witchcraft, real or imagined, stirred outrage and fear, but heresy struck at the deeper root of authority and destiny. It threatened the map by which people lived and hoped. So the greatest vigilance was reserved for words and beliefs that dared to diverge from the accepted path. In quiet corridors of power, and in the loud markets where ordinary people exchanged stories, that vigilance was constant. The medieval church's campaign against heresy reveals a world in which faith was both a communal pact and an existential anchor. Anything that threatened to loosen that anchor invited a fear far fiercer than mere superstition. Heretical groups moved in an organized way that witches and sorcerers did not. They gathered around doctrines, argued down church teaching, and in doing so posed a clear and often public threat to ecclesiastical authority. Witches, by contrast, rarely fit that picture of a coordinated enemy at the gates. In the villages and towns of medieval Europe, the word witch tended to mean someone ordinary and familiar. It was the neighbor at the edge of the fields, the midwife whose salves sometimes failed, the old woman with a sour temper or strange habits who made others uneasy. People feared real and immediate harms, sore animals, a blighted crop, a fever that would not break, and they looked for causes in the world they knew. That fear was intimate and local, a private misfortune to explain or a person to blame, not the headline of a continent-wide plot of devil worship. Even within the church's own records, that everyday logic often held sway. In dim, cool rooms where inquisitors read and wrote by candlelight, priests trained in theology and canon law treated cases of witchcraft as human problems. They asked whether an act or a charm denied the faith or crossed into heresy. If a woman was accused of cursing a neighbor or boiling a bad potion, judges usually saw a quarrel to settle, a civil dispute to untangle, a sin to be corrected, not evidence of a grand, organized conspiracy led by the devil. This posture lasted into the early 14th century, a policy of restraint. Church courts and inquisitorial tribunals, alert to doctrinal danger, generally refused to launch full prosecutions for ordinary sorcery unless it could be tied to heretical belief. The practical effect was a world where magic, when it appeared, was read as private malefaction or popular superstition, rather than an orchestrated diabolic campaign. That distinction, the private wound rather than the public siege, shaped how communities responded. It influenced who received care and who faced censure, how accusations were aired, and how the voices of accuser and accused were heard in the low light of parish houses and chapter rooms across medieval Europe. Heretics were a very different story. Certain sects really did grow in strength and reach, and they brought with them a new kind of fear. Perhaps the most dangerous example were the Cathars, who flourished in southern France through the 12th and 13th centuries. Their presence made the question of wrong belief not an abstract theological quarrel, but a living, visible challenge to the church's authority. And that visibility fed a restless, hungry rumor mill. There was a shape to the fears that moved through medieval towns and cloistered courts, a dark, patient intelligence people named with a single trembling word: Satan. In the language and theology of the day, he was more than an opponent of God. He was the great deceiver, a master of lies who could take the plainest truth and twist it until it lured men and women away from salvation. To be called a heretic, then, was never merely to be wrong about doctrine. It was to be suspected of having let your reason and soul be guided by something other than God, something cunning and cruel. Because the devil was imagined as an active agent in the world, any deviation from orthodoxy quickly gathered darker suppositions. Once a person or a sect was branded outside the fold, rumor bent toward the terrible. Neighbors who feared strange prayers or unfamiliar rites began to tell of secret meetings held by torchlight, of whispered litanies that inverted the parish mass, of rites performed in caverns or on distant farmsteads beyond the church's watchful eye, accusations of demon worship, pacts made in the night, or invocations of infernal names came to sit uncomfortably close to charges of doctrinal error. If belief could be twisted by the devil, then it was a short, anxious step to imagine he already had a hand in it. Persecution of heresy often carried with it a hum of more sensational charges. Alongside learned debates about sacraments and scriptural interpretation, talk rose of secret satanic rituals and maleficent magic, practices said to harm crops, bring disease, or blight a neighbor's fortunes. These tales fed one another. Doctrinal difference made people seem proud and stubborn, and pride in the popular imagination was an all too familiar opening for demonic influence. The more frightened a community became, the more readily it painted suspects with an ever-darkening palette until accusation and imagination were nearly indistinguishable. This pattern of thought did not stay confined to nameless sects in remote hamlets. It lifted into the highest orders of Christendom and touched institutions once celebrated without question. In the early 14th century, the aura around the Knights Templar, the warrior monks once vaunted for piety and prowess, was rent by such allegations. When charges were laid against them, the common repertoire of suspicion was brought out: whispers of inverted oaths, secret rites, practices that to the fearful seemed like sorcery or demonic collusion. Those extraordinary claims colored the public imagination. In hearths and pulpits, they made the accusations sound irresistible. Yet even amid lurid accusation, there was an important, steady anchor in law and theology. The central charge remained doctrinal. For judges and inquisitors who weighed these cases, the crucial question was whether the accused had denied, corrupted, or abandoned the church's teachings. The sensational stories, devil worship, secret magic, were often tacked onto the primary indictment, embellishments that inflamed public feeling and made condemnation more likely in the court of public opinion. In the formal voice of prosecution and in the careful wording of verdicts, however, it was heresy that held the decisive weight. That distinction mattered deeply. To be condemned as a witch suggested a different set of fears and remedies in the medieval mind. To be condemned as a heretic threatened the soul's relation to the church and to God himself. The difference drove legal language, shaped the punishments considered, and altered how communities narrated what had happened. Rumors of demonic misguidance and occult rites could and did paint the accused as monstrous in the streets and in sermons, but the machinery of prosecution was primarily concerned with conformity of belief and obedience of doctrine. Seen close up, these episodes reveal a human theater of anxiety. Priests and magistrates balancing doctrinal precision with the mob's appetite for scandal. Accused men and women listening, bewildered and afraid, to terrible catalogs of charge and countercharge. Neighbors exchanging rumor at the well and the market, imagination bending toward darkness because those explanations helped them make sense of misfortune. The figure of Satan as the great deceiver gave a coherent, if dreadful, answer. When belief strayed, it was not merely ignorance, but a betrayal orchestrated by a malign intelligence. So the medieval world moved, always listening for that whisper of deception. Where orthodoxy was threatened, people looked for the hand that had guided the mistake, and their eyes often fell upon an infernal puppeteer. Those suspicions could swell into allegations of demon worship, secret ceremonies, and maleficent magic, smearing even the most august orders with images of darkness. Yet when the parchment was signed and the verdicts read aloud, the legal and ecclesiastical centers of gravity stayed fixed on the charge that mattered most to them: heresy, a rupture with the Church's teaching, rather than primarily witchcraft. In that sober center lay the medieval world's real, enduring fear, not simply of persons who harmed, but of souls that had been turned away from the light. When people in a stone village spoke of sorcery at dusk, they were not always talking about the same thing. The word carried a heavy mix of fear, habit, and the careful judgments of priests and magistrates. In the long sweep of the Middle Ages, magic lived uneasily alongside faith and reason, sometimes as a household remedy, sometimes as a whispered accusation that could unravel a life. It was not, for most of that era, a crime in every instance. What made sorcery condemnable was not the turning of herbs in a mortar or a story told by firelight, but the intention and the harm, the maleficence that turned ordinary craft into deliberate injury. People ground herbs for fevers, tied small knots to ward off envy, and passed along charms like recipes. A midwife's whispered word, a shepherd's sign against wolves, a woman's poultice. These practices were braided into daily life and often looked indistinguishable from piety. Neighbors read them alongside psalms and prayers. Churchmen and civic judges judged such acts by their results. When a charm healed or a rite comforted, it was a useful art. When a curse seemed to bring sickness, a blighted crop, or the sudden death of a child, suspicion hardened and fear turned to accusation. That fear had a name: maleficium, the doing of harm. In courtrooms and cloistered offices, bishops and civic magistrates listened for proof. Did the accused intend ill? Could the suffering be explained another way? Witnesses were called, confessions weighed, and the context of the deed examined. Trials were not merely ceremonies of terror, they were processes in which motive and outcome mattered. In the village square and under the cold light of conventual courts, the same hands that blessed could also point and demand justice when harm was shown to be willful. The human atmosphere around these cases was thick and messy. People who had shared bread with the accused might now look away. Old grievances rose like sediment. Families pleaded for mercy. Priests prayed for guidance, and accusers spoke as if a real wound had been inflicted upon them. Sometimes the community response was ritual, penance that re-knit a torn fabric of relations. Sometimes it moved toward fines or exile, or toward sterner punishments that secular authorities could wield when fear took hold. Each response turned on a single judgment, that harm had been intended and inflicted. Scholars and theologians of the day debated these lines too. Some tried to refute the crude idea that every misfortune must come from a pact with demons. Others warned that deliberate harm might indeed involve sinister alliances. Those arguments helped shape how people understood guilt and agency, but in practice it was usually the visible harm and the perceived will behind it that mattered most. For most of the Middle Ages, then, sorcery became sin or crime not because of secret arts themselves, but because of what a person meant to do with them. In a world where the border between medicine and miracle, prayer and charm, could be thin and wavering, it was the will to hurt, maleficence, that severed an ordinary life from the protective norms of belief and community and set the machinery of judgment into motion. By the 13th and 14th centuries, learned men were growing increasingly anxious about magic. It was no longer enough to sneer at witches in sermons. Scholastic thinkers felt they had to build a rigorous theological case to condemn a practice that still tempted many. If magic was to be driven from Christian life, its critics argued, they would need reasons that could not be shrugged off as mere prejudice. The sorcerer's defense had a dangerous neatness to it. He would speak as if calling up a spirit were a technical skill, like a craftsman using tools. "I do not worship the thing I control," he would say with the cool assurance of someone who had practiced his lines. "I bind and order the spirit. I do not bow." To many this sounded plausible. Invocation as mastery, not devotion. The magician insisted his power came from cunning, ritual knowledge, and the confident deployment of names, signs, and symbols. That distinction, control rather than communion, was everything. To be accused of worship was to flirt with heresy and damnation, and the sorcerer's rhetoric kept one foot in the forbidden while the other stayed planted in a world still hungry for earthly power and occult answers. Those who wanted to refute him did not waste time arguing over clever turns of phrase. Instead, they pointed to what happened in practice. The critics observed a detail that refused to be dismissed. Spirits did not arrive simply because somebody intoned words or traced a perfect circle. They came because they were drawn. The magician, for all his talk of mastery, employed a bait. In the practical accounts the rebutters collected, the lure was often blunt and carnal. Blood, the acrid tang of fresh sacrifice, the hot, unmistakable fall of an animal's life into a bowl. These offerings were not symbolic. They were sensory summonses the spirit could not ignore. Once the spirit was tempted and appeared, it might indeed be bound and commanded. But that sequence, attraction, offering, binding, led to an uncomfortable moral arithmetic. Lay down a gift or spill a sacrifice to secure a spirit's help, and what looks like domination begins to look like a transaction. The ritual circle becomes, as critics like to say, a marketplace. The whispered name reads like a clause in a contract. The drop of blood acts as a seal. The ceremony's tools and tokens, meant to prove a magician's distance, started to read as signs of exchange. This was the accusation the critics pressed most urgently. To offer blood was not merely to feed a hunger, it was to enter into a relation. No amount of rhetorical distance could erase the smell, the sight, the evidence of reciprocity. Was this not, they demanded, a pact? The point was not hair-splitting. It reached to culpability itself. If a rite contained a bargain, then the actor had not simply manipulated a spirit, but partnered with it, becoming a debtor or sponsor in a moral accounting. For those who watched, the neat line between commanding and covenant blurred, and the charge that apparent mastery was in truth complicity cut deepest, because the proof lay in the very spoils the magician had hoped would excuse him. This argument facilitated a blanket condemnation of sorcerous demonology. However, it also had the effect of strengthening the association between sorcery and devil worship. In the damp, narrow streets of medieval Kilkenny, where river mist clung to stone and timber, and the church spire cut a sharp silhouette against the slate sky, a drama began in 1324 that would echo through the histories of witch hunting. The town was small and intimate. Houses stood so close that neighbors could hear every quarrel. Reputation was fragile, and a single rumor could become a charge when wrapped in the language of sin and danger. The world then was combustible. Quarrels over money, marriage, land, or influence could quickly be framed as spiritual crimes. The earliest persecutions of sorcerers and witches did not target idle superstition so much as practices that touched the church's deepest fears: ritual magic, pacts with unseen forces, and the dark choreography of demonology. Those practices invited words like demon and pact, and once the words were spoken, ordinary disputes could flip into accusations of heresy. Into that charged atmosphere stepped Dame Alice Caitler, a woman of means and influence who had survived more than one marriage in a time when widows could amass property and provoke envy. She was accused in 1324, and the case spilled into the following year, setting bishop against household, faith against family. Richard de Ledred, the Bishop of Ossory, saw in Alice's life not only traces of alleged sorcery, but a challenge to ecclesiastical authority itself. He brought charges that centered on ritual practices where demons were said to be invoked and controlled, the very behaviors the church had come to single out as a most dangerous. The proceedings were neither tidy nor purely spiritual. Political motive and social tension threaded through every accusation. Alice's station won her allies among the local Anglo-Irish elite. Her accusers included neighbors and kin whose sense of order had been pricked. The bishop's court and the household became battlegrounds where law, power, and belief collided. When the bishop pushed the case forward, he reached into the intimate spaces of the house, turning private quarrels into public evidence. One of Alice's servants, a young woman named Petronilla de Maith, was seized and interrogated. Under pressure and torture, she confessed to acts the inquisitors could frame as proof of a pact with the demonic, confessions that, in that era, carried inexorable weight. In a world that equated confession with truth, her words were taken as the final proof the church sought. Petronilla's fate was swift and terrible. She was burned in 1324 or 1325, becoming the first person in Ireland on record to be executed for witchcraft. The flames were intended as a demonstration, a severing of the alleged tie to darker forces, and a stark warning to others. The smell of smoke and the roar of a pyre would have stayed in the minds of those who watched, a public lesson in the costs of being named. Dame Alice herself, by contrast, managed to evade the same end. With allies and resources at her disposal, she fled. Records suggest she escaped to England and avoided the full force of the bishop's court. The contrast between the servant who perished and the well-connected woman who fled made painfully clear how intertwined these persecutions were with questions of rank, influence, and the brittle hierarchies of medieval life. This was not simply a tale of superstition, it was a collision of judicial zeal, clerical authority, and local politics, played out through the charged vocabulary of ritual magic and demonology. Early prosecutions concentrated on ritual magic precisely because those practices invited talk of demons and pacts. Once that language was used, secular grievances could be transformed into charges of heresy. In Kilkenny, in 1324 and 1325, the ambition of a bishop and the vulnerability of a household combined to create a tragedy retold for centuries. Accusation, confession, power, and the terrible cost when fear of the unseen is used to settle scores in the seen world. Although many of the earliest persecutions before about 1330 were driven more by politics than by pure superstition, one of the clearest early examples came in Ireland in 1324-25 with the trial of Dame Alice Keitler. The motive for her prosecution was almost certainly political, but the way the accusations were cast made them sound like something far grimmer than a local quarrel. In the packed hall that day, the words used against her were chosen to do more than accuse. They were meant to reshape how everyone in the room understood her life. The first word landed like a cold draft through the rafters: maleficia. It was not a dry legal term read from a law book, but something spat into the air between faces and carried by the hush of the crowd. She stood beneath the pale beams and the carved gallery, the light from the small, leaded windows drawing thin bars across her hands. People leaned forward as though to catch each syllable. The clerk's quill hovered above the parchment, then stopped. To those assembled, the Latin did not float free of meaning. It stuck. Maleficia meant the doing of harm by means other men did not understand, a category for everything that ruined crops, brought sickness, or upset the ordinary order of life. That accusation described a kind of bad magic, the sort priests and neighbors feared, sorcery used to injure, to blight fields, to send misfortune into a household. But the prosecutors did not leave it there. They added another charge, and this one was meant to break what little sympathy might remain. She was part of a secret heretic sect. The words secret and heretic carried a heavier, darker weight. Maleficia could, in some places, sound like gossip or a charge about skills gone wrong. Heresy accused a turning away from the church itself, a breach of the faith that bound the community. The difference mattered. The church's teaching at the time allowed for a distinction between private suspicion and matters that required ecclesiastical law, the line between neighborly quarrel and a crime against salvation. Those who opposed Dame Alice knew this well. By layering the claim of Maleficia with the charge of secret heresy, they elevated a suspected craft into a spiritual emergency, pulling the whole matter under the authority of priests and magistrates. What might have been a local dispute over remedies or reputation became a case about creed and the safety of souls. So she stood while words that mixed ordinary fears with sacred condemnation fell around her, watched by a congregation whose murmurs rose and fell like wind. The charges did more than list alleged crimes. They redefined her in the eyes of everyone present. No longer merely a woman accused of strange arts, she was now painted as someone in league with forces both harmful and unfaithful. An image the church had made painfully clear was the sort that demanded its fullest attention. The case against Alice reads like a litany of fears the courts knew how to name. The prosecutors recycled accusations that had been used against the Templars nearly 20 years before. Meetings held in secret, denial of the cross, sacrifices to demons, lewd sexual acts. There were even the darker touches meant to shock a jury, brewing evil potions from the clothing of dead babies. Each charge was a familiar script, one that moved easily from rumor into indictment. Yet when you turn the page, in the margins of the record, something quieter stirs. It isn't the fully formed monster that later centuries will decorate with horns and broomsticks. It's an idea, half-shadowed and tentative, making its first appearance in people's lives. The notion of the witch is present, but still fragile, not a systematized enemy fixed in law, but a vague figure at the edges of everyday concern. Picture a village evening after the fields have fallen silent, and the last light pulls back over the hedgerows. Families draw close to the hearth. Voices drop and stretch thin as smoke when neighbors trade stories. A cough that won't relent, a child twitching in fevered sleep, a sow that fails to give milk. Near the fire there is a woman with a small chest of herbs and salts. She can knot a splint, set a bone, smear a poultice of willow bark, and press cool leaves to a fevered forehead. People come to her grateful, speaking the names of plants as if they were blessings, and yet they glance at one another with a faint unease. Words around this woman are cautious, a mix of thanks and suspicion. Rituals appear in the record almost as though overheard. Old names for charms and prayers jotted without verdict. Folk remedies sit beside whispered accusations in the same breath. An old rite murmured at dusk, a charm spoken under the breath, can be heard as either tender care or something strange and dangerous, depending on who is listening and how fearful the listener is that day. What the documents show is not a legal creature, but a constellation of local needs and anxieties. This early witch is a patchwork of roles: healer and outsider, keeper of lore, and the possible source of harm. She is familiar in ways a neighbor is familiar. The cadence of her voice, the scratch of her hands, and yet she carries an otherness that the community finds hard to name. When a harvest fails or an illness arrives without explanation, people look for a cause, and sometimes that search settles on her. There is also warmth tangled in the fear. In moments of desperate illness, when roads were impassable and doctors far away, folks went to her with their last hopes. She eased labors, staunched wounds, eased pain with the handfuls of remedies she kept in a worn wooden box. Sometimes those remedies saved lives. Sometimes they simply carried families through a season of misfortune. That reliance complicated the suspicion. Gratitude and dread lived in the same house, like two people sharing a bench. So the image of the witch at this stage is hesitant and rough cut. The vocabulary that will later harden into doctrine, a language of heresy, devilry, and ritualized evil, has not yet settled. Instead, there is a seed of an idea, a slender thing that can be read in different ways. Over time, that seed will sprout into something far more certain and much darker, drawn in the sharp lines of court records and prints. For now, though, she occupies an uncertain space, ordinary and uncanny, known and barely named, a presence that hints at deeper fears without quite revealing them. There are moments in history when the air itself seems to thicken with suspicion, when fear and power press so close together that every whisper feels like a threat. It was one of those moments in 1441, at a court still ruled in name by a boy on the throne. Henry VI was barely more than a child, and the crown he wore made every rumor matter and every forecast of illness sound like a prelude to disaster. In that brittle atmosphere, the name of Eleanor Cobham acquired a darkness all its own. Eleanor moved through the glitter and shadow of the royal household with a presence that invited both admiration and scrutiny. Courtiers watched her closely. Petitioners came to her. Rivals watched for the smallest misstep. So when astrologers, the men of the day who claimed to read the heavens and translate portents into fate, spoke of a sickness that would fall upon the young king, their words landed like stones in a placid pond. Ripples of alarm spread quickly. Who had asked for such omens? Who might have wished ill upon the boy king? The answer some in the court chose was sharp and deliberate. Eleanor had consulted those astrologers. She had employed arts deemed forbidden and dangerous. She had meddled with forces that could harm the sovereign. In a world where ambition and rivalry were as ordinary as courtly manners, the suggestion that someone had sought to influence the king's fate could be shaped into a weapon. Accusations of witchcraft and sorcery were not only about belief, they were a tool to cut reputations, isolate rivals, and change the balance of power. Eleanor protested fiercely. She denied plotting against the king or using astrologers to harm his health, yet she could not deny everything. She admitted to buying a series of small, secretive items from a woman named Marjorie Germain. Eleanor explained them in the plainest terms she could. They were potions and remedies meant to help her conceive. It was a private, human longing, the desire for a child, for an heir, for the security that came with succession in a household watched by the whole realm. Marjorie Germain herself was no shadowy figure tucked away in a cottage. She was known across the land, a woman whose name crossed the thresholds of both humble homes and noble halls. People of rank and commoners alike sought her counsel and her remedies. And yet, despite Marjorie's many clients among the powerful, it was Eleanor alone who was singled out when the court needed a focus for its anxieties. The same remedy that many might consider a discreet hope for an heir became, for Eleanor, evidence of a darker intent. Picture the scene, an antechamber wrapped in silence, courtiers leaning forward to catch fragments of rumor, the hush that comes just before judgment. Eleanor, who had turned to remedies in private, found that the ordinary pain of longing had been transformed into public fury. A humble confession about potions, read at its most charitable as the act of a woman trying to fulfill a painful private need, was recast as proof of conspiracy against the king. This was not simply superstition run wild. It was politics wearing the mask of piety and fear. To accuse someone of consorting with astrologers and witches was to question their loyalty, their reason, even their humanity. Such charges could reshape public opinion literally overnight, turning a private act into a crime against the kingdom. Eleanor's denials, her admission about the potions, and Marjorie's name moved their story from private grief into a very public spectacle. A clear example of how fragile reputation could be when the language of magic was available to be wielded. Beneath the grand tapestries and behind the carved oak, very human pressures pulsed. The terror of a sick monarch, the relentless demand on women to produce heirs, the rivalries that hunted for the slightest transgression to exploit. The case of Eleanor Cobham is a sharp reminder of how superstition, folk medicine, and political calculation could be marshaled against a single person. Marjorie's craft was sought by many. Eleanor's fate, accused where others were not, shows how quickly private need could be turned into public accusation in an age when the line between sorcery and service was perilously thin. An old woodcut caption reads, "Illustration of Eleanor Cobham doing penance for being a witch." Picture that image for a moment. A woman once wrapped in silk and silver, used to the hush of candles in private chambers, and the way courtiers made room for a name that carried weight. Eleanor Cobham moved through the halls of power with an easy, familiar grace. Then, almost overnight, the same streets that had bowed to her became the narrow avenues of accusation. She was publicly charged with something the age feared above all: treasonable necromancy, an allegation that married the old dread of witchcraft to the sharper anxiety of politics. In plain terms, her enemies said magic had been bent toward the throne. The charge did not stand alone. By her side was Marjorie, a woman long whispered about for charms and strange arts. A handful of Eleanor's acquaintances and retainers were swept into the inquiry. Learned men of the household, women from the town, all linked by two things: closeness to the Duchess and the terrible claim that they had conspired to meddle with fate, to forecast or even bring about harm to the king. The court turned their lives like fragile stones, looking for a pattern that would justify punishment. For those of lesser rank, the law was swift and brutal. Marjorie's fate was meant to be a lesson. The sentence reached her with the full horror of public execution. Others in the circle met similar grisly ends. Their last hours were filled by the very terror their supposed arts had once inspired in others. These executions echoed through market squares and up narrow lanes, a warning written in smoke and blood for anyone who might think to follow. Eleanor herself was spared the scaffold, a decision that many found scandalous. She was imprisoned, judged guilty, but not condemned to death. Instead, her punishment was a blend of severance and spectacle. She was forced to divorce her husband, stripped of the intimate bond and status that had defined her life. She was sentenced to life in confinement, shut away from the world of power that had made her both visible and vulnerable. As if to make every parishioner a witness to her disgrace, the court ordered her to perform public penance, to walk, barefoot, between 3 churches. Imagine the cold stone underfoot, the sting of wind on bare skin, the tug of humiliation at the edges of her dignity. Picture her moving slowly beneath the gaze of those who had once curtsied or whispered her name, each step a public accounting. The ritual was both physical suffering and moral theater, meant to mark her in the sight of God and of men. There is a terrible intimacy to such a fall. To be accused of necromancy and spared the death reserved for treason, to be stripped of marriage and bound for life in a cell, and yet to be made to walk in the open, each act of punishment and exposure braided together. It tells of a moment when fear, law, and brittle hierarchies met and broke a life into pieces visible to all. In the end, Eleanor's story is not only about accusation and penalty, but about how quickly a life of power can be unmade and displayed, a cautionary tale written in footsteps on cold stone. Her prosecution wore its politics plainly. Eleanor's downfall did not happen in a vacuum. Her husband, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had enemies eager for any chance to reduce his power. To wound his household was to wound him, and the Duchess's conviction became a public blow against his reputation and authority. If Eleanor had been a private, unremarkable widow, or a gentlewoman with a few acres, her secret experiments with charms and curious books might have stayed whispered scandals traded by the hearth over late wine. But she was not anonymous. She was the Duchess of Gloucester, married to one of the kingdom's most powerful men, and in a court tuned to rivalry, every private eccentricity was exposed to the hard light of politics. Picture the Tudor gray corridors of power, where a single idle comment could be sharpened into an accusation. Court life was a theater of ambition. Patronage circulated like coin. Alliances were made and broken between courses, and enemies lurked behind courteous smiles. In that atmosphere, even talk of consulting astrologers or seeking counsel about fate looked less like superstition and more like a lever to be used against the Duke's household. Magic itself became a tool and a threat. Those who whispered of fortunes and misfortunes, astrologers, midwives, learned men and women steeped in older practices, were dragged into the orbit of the case. The prosecution spread outward, ensnaring anyone who had been involved in Eleanor's quiet experiments and treating arcane counsel as if it were a political crime. Some of the people implicated met brutal ends. Marjorie Jourdemain, whose name the records keep, was burned in a grim public spectacle meant to scorch not only her flesh, but the rumors she represented. Others received punishments arranged as lessons, sentences calculated to show that counsel or curiosity could, in that moment, be treated as treasonous. Eleanor herself paid a price shaped as much by politics as by law. Stripped of honors, forced into public penance, she was removed from the warm center of courtly life and sequestered into a cold exile of confinement and silence. The rituals of condemnation, public shame, the removal of status, enforced solitude were staged to demonstrate that even the highest could be humbled when the state feared instability. Imagine her then, once striding beneath painted beams and across tapestried halls with the quiet authority of rank, now diminished by ritual and rumor. Her private turn toward the occult, born perhaps of grief, curiosity, or a desperate wish to steer uncertain futures, was transformed by politics into a public catastrophe. Had she not been yoked to such a powerful man, what might have been little more than a gossip among friends would never have burned so fiercely through the chronicles of the age. Until about 1330, the world moved by a different kind of law: custom, negotiation, the slow authority of local leaders. Trials for witchcraft or sorcery did happen, but they were the exception, not the rule. They were instruments pulled out when a ruler needed to settle a score, when a village elder wanted to silence a troublemaker, or when one faction wanted to break a rival's power. In the courts and market squares where decisions were made, accusations without political motive were uncommon. They landed as deliberate strikes, not as the sudden flares of mass panic we picture in later centuries. Picture one of those early scenes: a dimly lit hall, timber rafters black with soot, a handful of men in fur cloaks and worn leather boots leaning toward a central figure who holds the ledger of complaints. Outside, the wind pushes snow or dust along the narrow streets. Inside, voices are low and calculating. When a charge of witchcraft is brought, it rarely sounds like the cry of an unmoored populace. It is a weapon fashioned by those who already have power, aimed where advantage might be won or authority reinforced. Even so, these rare prosecutions did something quieter and more consequential. Each case laid a stone in a legal pathway, a precedent others could follow. The simple act of bringing someone suspected of sorcery before a tribunal, of reading accusations aloud, demanding an answer, documenting testimony, taught communities and magistrates that certain supernatural offenses could be treated as matters for judgment. Those early proceedings were solemn and pragmatic, but they whispered a new possibility into the public imagination: that particular people, those suspected of sorcery, could and should be singled out, examined, and punished. That whisper was the start of a slow, dangerous alchemy. Repetition and example turned calculated actions into expectation. Stories from trials traveled. Listeners in taverns and assemblies carried them back to hearths and fields. and other local lords watched and learned how accusation might be used as leverage. The precedent did not ignite into frenzy overnight, but it bent the arc of what seemed permissible. Over time, prosecuting witches and sorcerers became not only conceivable, but for some, an appropriate response to fear, conflict, or rival ambition. In those sober, early trials, the outline of a future readiness was already being drawn. What began as isolated, politically charged prosecutions set a pattern that later generations would fill in, piece by piece, until the path from accusation to punishment became tragically familiar. By the mid-14th century, persecution had taken on a new edge. Accusations of devil worship, pacts with demons, and secret conspiracies to perform malefic acts began to surface with disturbing frequency. At first, when authorities cast their nets, they aimed at a particular and unmistakable quarry: the learned men who wore scholars' robes and worked by candlelight in rooms lined with books. These ritual sorcerers spoke Latin, inscribed names on vellum, and performed ceremonies that looked like both study and transgression: elaborate conjurations, chalk diagrams on the floor, grimoires heavy with ink and arcane instructions. They were conspicuous. Their language, their books, and public disputations left little doubt about the world they trafficked in. For magistrates and preachers, it was easy at first to point to a visible, intelligible enemy. But the net did not stay small. Gradually, the idea of dangerous magic crept out of the book-lined chambers and into the lanes and cottages. There, other kinds of people practiced an uncanny knowledge. Women who knitted charms into a newborn swaddling, who stirred bitter herbs into a sick man's broth, who bent over a laboring woman and, with hands that knew exactly where to press and what words to murmur, coaxed life into the world. These women did not summon demons from books. Their craft was intimate and diffuse, rooted in custom and experience rather than in learned syllogism. They mixed prayers with incantations, rosemary with whispered threats, keeping secrets, settling disputes with a look, reading omens in the weather and the behavior of cattle. In many regions, the ritual sorcerers remained a largely male company, clerics and scholars with access to education and to the Latin that ritual required. By contrast, a far higher proportion of the folk practitioners were women, midwives, healers, wise women, and cunning folk whose authority grew out of necessity and local tradition. Their tools were household implements and bundles of herbs rather than bound books, and they lived among their neighbors. That closeness, however, made them vulnerable in a new and terrible way. The very habits that had once made a woman useful in a village, her knowledge of births and plants, her willingness to help quietly when official medicine could not, began to be read as evidence of a darker power. Rumor and sermon braided together. A preacher's warning against hidden arts sounded very different in the ear of a magistrate than it did to a mother at her spinning. People in parishes and markets started to notice and name what had long been accepted: unexplained illnesses, failed harvests, sudden deaths. When explanations were demanded, the easy answer drifted toward the nearest, most visible scapegoat. The shift did not come from a single edict or an overnight purge. It took root in conversations by fires, in jealousies, in the brutal arithmetic of misfortune. But its effect was the same: a growing, dangerous association of women with witchcraft, one that could be kindled by gossip and fanned by fear. What began as an effort to police an elite, bookish transgression transformed into a far broader, more intimate terror. The scholarly rituals continued to be denounced, but another kind of accusation moved into the home, an accusation that could touch midwives at their benches, grandmothers by their hearths, solitary women who lived by the hedgerow and knew the language of plants. The widening of the net did not invent new magic. It simply changed where people looked for blame. In doing so, it braided the fate of women into the story of witchcraft, a terrible entanglement that would rip at the social fabric of communities with a slow, relentless pressure coming as much from within as from above. By the late 14th century, the old image of witches had shifted. Witchcraft and devil worship grew increasingly linked in people's minds, and accusations that once sounded like gossip began to carry a darker, more sinister charge. That new association turned rumor into something harder to fight, a crime not only against neighbors, but against God. In the high, narrow valleys of Valais, where the Alps press villages into crescents of roofs and stone, the year 1498 opened under a hush that would not lift for years. What began as suspicion and rumor became a systematic hunt. Over the next 8 grim years, the campaign crept through town and hamlet until the tally read 367 people pursued as witches and put to death. The number is clinical, but behind it were kitchens emptied of laughter, fields left untended, and children taught to look away when a neighbor was taken. The machinery of accusation moved like a fog, muffling reason and amplifying fear. To modern ears, the picture surprises. In Valais, most of those singled out were men. At a time when later stories would make the witch an old woman bent over a cauldron, these prosecutions often targeted laborers, shepherds, itinerant figures, people who, in a precarious mountain economy, stood apart, and therefore became easy prey for suspicion. That distance from the settled life of a village was enough to make a person vulnerable. The charges themselves were never limited to a private grudge. Neighbors named those they hated for witchcraft, certainly, but also for murder and heresy, words that together made a triangle of dread. Accused of all three, a person lost every protection: legal, social, and spiritual. Once those labels were pinned on someone, old ties frayed and reason gave way to panic. There was a powerful need, shared by churchmen and lay people, to make sense of these crimes as more than isolated acts. A single misdeed could be written off as quarrel or bad luck. A conspiracy of witches implied something worse, an organized spiritual rebellion. To many minds, only by adding heresy to the charge could maleficence become a coherent plot. With heresy in the mix, the hunt acquired a grim purpose. Not merely revenge, but a kind of defensive purification, an attempt to cleanse the community. Observers recorded what happened. Among them, the Dominican theologian Johannes Nieder gathered testimonies from Valais and wrestled with how to explain the events both theologically and socially. He and others took those raw records and turned them into arguments that traveled beyond the valleys, helping to shape the idea that witchcraft was a subterranean organized threat, a notion that would haunt Europe for generations. For the people who lived through it, however, these were not debates on paper, but real losses. Lives taken, families bereft, and a landscape of trust torn into 1,000 fragile pieces by 8 relentless years of accusation. A medieval woodcut shows the punishment of witches, a stark image that captures more than a single moment. After the late 14th century, something like a chill moved through the courts and cottages of Europe. What had once been muttered explanations for a bad season or a string of sick animals hardened into a search for a human face to blame. Persecution and burning crept from rumor into law, and the everyday rhythms of life grew sharp with fear. Furtive glances along lanes, doors bolted against gossip, neighbors speaking in low, urgent tones as if their words might summon a fate. It was in the aftermath of one such outbreak, the trials in the Valais, a region of steep slopes and stony fields, that a learned man turned his attention to this terrible business. Johannes Nieder did not simply echo the rumors. He approached the Valais trials with the careful, unsettled eye of someone trying to make pattern out of panic. He compared one testimony with another, weighed confessions often taken under pressure, and gathered accounts from different towns where the same fearful logic had spread. The image of the Valais was not a single blaze, but a series of sparks lighting similar fires. Nieder's scrutiny reached beyond those mountain passes. He collected cases of reported sorcery and witchcraft from across regions, fitting fragments of frightened lives into a broader picture. What emerged was not lone mischief, but a phenomenon moving like wildfire. Accusations that leapt from household to household, rituals and confessions shaped as much by terror as by belief, and legal procedures that turned social panic into sanctioned violence. Faced with this unfolding pattern, Nider found himself pressurized by a single question: how should a Christian community understand and respond to such a threat? That question pushed him to act. Moved by the urgency of what he saw and the weight of accumulating evidence, Nider set his thoughts down in a treatise, a reasoned attempt to define and codify witchcraft for those who would judge, preach, and govern. In those pages, the scattered tales of the Valais and other places were gathered and made to speak together, translated into terms lawyers, clerics, and lay people could use. He tried to bring order to a fog of suspicion, sketching the outlines of a crime and proposing moral and legal frameworks for confronting it. In doing so, Nider became one of the earliest scholars to treat witchcraft as a subject for formal study rather than private fear. He did not create the anxieties that haunted towns and valleys. He tried to catch them, put them into ink, and force a trembling society to look squarely at what it had begun to do. The result is a sober, unsettling effort to bring reason to the chaos of accusation, a calm, scholarly voice joining the clamor, attempting to turn scattered panic into something that could be studied, judged, and perhaps contained. The fruit of Johannes Nider's long inquiry appeared as a single concentrated work. Formicarius, written between 1435 and 1437. It was not a dry ledger of facts, but a book born of alarm, the kind of book that arrives after months or years of watching patterns, of listening for faint and dangerous notes of heresy and sorcery among the living. When the pages finally took shape, they seemed to pulse with urgency. Even the quietest sentence carries the feeling that this is not merely a study, but a warning sent into a world that might not yet understand the danger it faces. Nider set out again and again to strip the notion of witchcraft of any gentle fiction. This was not harmless dabbling in charms or quaint folk practices. In his account, the core of the crime was spiritual and absolute. To practice sorcery, he argued, was to renounce baptismal vows, to spit upon the cross, to make of one's life a deliberate desertion of God. He chose stark, unforgiving words: renunciation, trampling, sale of the soul, phrases that recur through the book like a tolling bell meant to wake a complacent world and to impress on readers the gravity of what he described. He was as interested in the people involved as in their acts. Nider watched how the idea of witchcraft lived and spread among ordinary men and women, slipping into marketplaces and cottages, settling into the small routines of daily life, gathering force as rumor hardened into suspicion. The danger, he insisted, nested among common folk, in whispered accusations around the hearth, in furtive exchanges at the village well, in petty resentments that could be fanned into something monstrous. He singled out women with particular emphasis, holding that the practices he condemned were especially common among them. This was not idle gossip, he insisted, but a solemn judgment meant to reveal a wider rot within community and conscience. Throughout Formicarius, the tone is relentless yet purposeful. Nider does not rely on lurid imagination or sensational storytelling. He lays out his case with crisp, implacable clarity. Witchcraft, in his view, is not an isolated misdeed, but a kind of spiritual revolution against Christian life, an inward turning away that, if left unchecked, threatens the fabric of communal faith. For him, the most chilling act was the willing sale of the soul, a betrayal that closes off mercy and demands a severe response. He wanted readers to feel the weight of that betrayal and to see the problem for what he believed it truly was: more frequent, more intimate, and far more serious than people commonly imagined. Page by page, a portrait of a society at unease comes into focus, a chronicler who refuses complacency, who catalogs small signs as if tracing the slow spread of a fever. Between 1435 and 1437, in the plain, insistent voice of Formicarius, Nieder sought to transform vague fears into a clear indictment and to rouse his contemporaries to vigilance, to recognize, before it was too late, the danger he thought was spreading quietly among them. For Macarius arrived like a jolt. For many readers of its day, the book introduced entirely new ways of thinking. Nieder drew a direct line between devil worship and witchcraft, and he dwelt more insistently than most on the figure of the female witch. These emphases surprised and unsettled people. The images and stories it carried into the daylight were unlike the older, quieter rumors that had drifted through villages and cloisters. Even so, Nieder did not ride that shock into a call for wholesale slaughter. He refused to feed the appetite for spectacle that sometimes seized magistrates and crowds. Instead of joining the drumbeat for witch hunts, he wrote with the weary patience of a man who had seen how panic and zeal distort judgment. What hurt him was not the thrill of accusation, but a sorrow for a church he believed was ill at its heart. To Nieder, witchcraft was less an enemy to be incinerated than a symptom of deeper sickness. He asked readers to look beyond torches and shouting to the root causes he saw as far more dangerous: neglect of prayer, slipping discipline, the slow erosion of communal devotion. The remedy he proposed was inward and moral, not punitive, confession and penance, a revival of the steady, familiar cadences of monastic life, and a return to pastoral care practiced with conscience and charity. He sketched for his audience a different kind of response: cloisters where the ancient offices were watched and kept with reverence, novices formed in humility, pastors tending their flocks through teaching and example rather than fear. Imagine the echo of a chapel bell calling monks to their hours, the scent of incense and damp stone, a room where routines of prayer knotted the scattered lives of a community back into order. That vision, to Nieder, would weaken whatever dark things prospered in neglect. Picture him at a wooden table, quill in hand, a candle guttering in the draught as he set down these convictions. He feared the public spectacle of human beings consigned to flames far more than he feared the specter of witchcraft itself, not because he pretended maleficent acts never occurred, but because he understood how quickly accusation metastasized into injustice when churchmen lacked firmness, prayerfulness, and pastoral care. Accusation without steady hands, he believed, became a contagious cruelty. His remedy was slow, patient work: reform the clergy, restore the rites, revive the disciplines that knit communities together. Let worship be re-centered and monastic observance renewed. Insist that pastors practice sincere ministry, listening and guiding rather than inciting terror. In Nieder's thinking, faith properly lived would starve the illusions and fears that fed so many accusations. This was not mere preference, but a moral principle. Punishment without prudence risks doing more harm than the sins it hopes to cure. Nieder's voice, then, reads less like a call to arms and more like a plea for a church capable of healing. In that quiet conviction, he placed his hope not in the crackle of bonfires, but in the slow, luminous labor of reform, an attention to prayer, discipline, and charity that might, over time, banish the darkness bred by neglect. Whatever the scholars meant when they wrote, whatever precise arguments Nieder and his peers argued over in cold cloisters and crowded lecture halls, their words did not stay there. In towns like Marmande in 1453, learned debate seeped slowly into everyday life. A cautionary paragraph in a sermon, a moral example tossed off during a disputation, a whispered retelling at the market. These small things added up. At first it was barely noticeable, but the pattern formed until the idea that had been only an abstract question came to look like a real, present danger. Little signs began to be read as proof. People who once looked to the sky for weather or to the fields for harvest now listened for hints of conspiracy in ordinary sounds: the creak of a roof beam, the sudden sickness of a child, the way someone's hand trembled. Faces in the street took on new meanings. A scowl, a scuffle, even an ill-timed laugh could be spun into evidence of guilt. Neighbors who had shared bread and gossip for years started to glance away, terrified that a casual remark would be remembered and turned into an accusation. The familiar rhythms of church life only made the fear louder. Bells that once marked hours and feasts sounded like warnings. Confessions and the stern gestures of preachers came to feel like the beginning of an inquest. Old superstitions that had been tolerated or shrugged off were now examined with the intensity of a tribunal. Rumor moved like a slow fever through villages and towns, and by the mid-15th century that fever had seized the public mind. What had begun as intellectual curiosity turned into private dread, and an atmosphere of suspicion settled over ordinary life, ready in some places to burst into panic and mob violence. In 1453, in the small French village of Marmande, an epidemic swept through the people, and the explanations that followed were as human as they were fearful. The sickness was blamed on maleficent sorcery. At first, the authorities pointed to a single local woman, naming her as the cause of the misfortune. That accusation, however, landed in a place already primed for suspicion, and it did not stay isolated for long. The story began quietly, like a single fallen leaf rolling down a lane, picked up by a child, passed along with a laugh, then repeated in a doorway. But as neighbors gathered by hearths and wells, that whisper thickened. In the long shadows of winter evenings, with people sitting closer to the fire and speaking in lower voices, the rumor took on a life of its own. What had been a glance, a murmur, became a sketch of something worse. Not one offender at the village edge, but a hidden knot of conspirators who might meet by moonlight. Every ordinary event was rearranged to fit the new story. A cow calving late, a sudden fever, an angry word that lingered. These small things were read back as evidence of a deliberate plot. The town's rhythms shifted, children hushed, doors were latched earlier, and conversations grew clipped. Where once neighbors shared bread and gossip, they now measured themselves against one another with narrowed eyes, searching for signs that could be folded into the tale of witchcraft. Clergy and magistrates found themselves pulled into the widening net. Sermons and proclamations tried to name and contain the fear, but they sometimes fanned it, giving official weight to what had been private dread. And when the authorities had named a single woman, the villagers' worries did not stop. Instead, they hardened into a conviction that there were more conspirators hidden among them. Fearing that the village's safety depended on rooting out this invisible threat, a mob took the law into its own hands. In a terrible sweep, a couple of dozen alleged witches, all women, were seized by their neighbors. They were subjected to torture designed to force confessions. 2 of them died under that cruelty. Those who broke and confessed were condemned in the only way the mob and courts could imagine, burned at the stake. It is a small, cruel lesson in how fear reshapes a community. Suspicion, once given a body, can become a force that erases nuance and justice. In Marmande, ordinary lives were turned into evidence, and a village, convinced it was defending itself, left behind a trail of violence that would outlive the epidemic it sought to explain. In the years 1484 to 1486, a man named Heinrich Kramer moved through the thick candlelight of a late 15th century cloister, as if the shadows themselves were names he must call and consign. He wore the sober habit of a Dominican, but his face never settled into the calm mask of routine devotion. There was something urgent in the way he stepped past flickering altars and stone ribs, a patient intensity that made him seem less like a parish priest than like an investigator following a trail only he could sense. Kramer lived in a world that felt close and porous, where the edge of a village bled into the forest and rumor could cross that border as easily as a cart on the road. To most people, such crossings were the mischief of superstition. Women's tales, sudden fits of sickness, quarrels settled by gossip. To Kramer, they were signs of a different order, secret arts and unseen malefactions spreading like a slow rot. He kept vigil over every complaint and whisper, the way a man watches a dying ember, not trusting it to go out. By day, he worked among manuscripts and Latin phrases. By night, he paced the cloister with rosary in hand, imagining the harm that might leap from one household to the next if the church did not look harder and act faster. What drove him was less the pursuit of rank than a fierce, fearful conviction that witchcraft was a real and present danger to souls and communities. Where others counseled caution or shrugged things off, Kramer heard complacency and felt alarm. That urgency sharpened every prayer, every ledger, every interrogation he undertook. He became, above all, a man possessed by his belief, convinced that darkness was spreading, certain that tireless eyes and relentless faith were needed to name it and meet it before it consumed more than individual lives. In 1484, Kramer secured a papal bull that gave him the sweeping authority to investigate witchcraft anywhere in Germany. It was a powerful endorsement, but it did not win universal trust. Even as he carried that mandate, senior German clerics watched with unease. Many remained skeptical of the zeal with which he pursued his cause. Under Kramer's scrutiny, Innsbruck felt smaller and stranger. Narrow streets climbed toward the ridged silhouette of the Alps, and churches and council houses leaned close as if to whisper secrets. Into that compact world came a man who moved with the certainty of someone on a sacred mission, to seek out, expose, and punish what he believed were the workings of witchcraft. That certainty eventually collided with a woman who would not fit the script he preferred. Helena Schöberin was a presence in the town, wealthy, outspoken, quick with a tongue that cut through evasions. She was richer than most of her neighbors and unafraid to speak her mind. When Kramer's investigation spread like a chill rumor from house to house, Helena watched and grew angry. She saw something others found easier to ignore. This was not a careful pursuit of justice, but a relentless campaign that fed on spectacle and fear. To her, Kramer's work threatened the ordinary lives of Innsbruck's women rather than protecting the community from real harm. Her objections were public and unavoidable. Helena made a habit of interrupting sermons, standing in the press of parishioners and cutting through the preacher's words like a bell. When Kramer spoke, urging vigilance, repentance, and the rooting out of sin, she rose among the congregation and unpicked his rhetoric with either mocking calm or fierce indignation. What looked to some like scandal read to others as courage. A wealthy woman openly defying a zealous inquisitor where his voice should have gone unchallenged. Kramer did not answer with debate so much as with accusation. He set about collecting charges, folding Helena's interruptions into the dossier he was building. She, along with half a dozen other women, found herself pulled before him under the gravest of suspicions, to stand trial for witchcraft. The process was formal and dreadful, but it was also visibly shaped by the characters in the room. Kramer with his implacable inquisitorial posture, and Helena with a stubborn pride that refused to be shamed into silence. When the questioning began, Kramer's inquiries took on a narrow, fierce tone. Rather than broad questions about pacts with the devil or nocturnal gatherings, he pressed at Helena's private life with an almost single-minded obsession. His interrogation kept returning to alleged promiscuity and lascivious behavior, hunting for intimacies and whispers that could be read as sexual transgression. The questions were clinical and repetitive, a ruthless litany designed to unmake a woman by laying bare the most intimate parts of her past. Helena met this with defiance. Whether driven by anger, pride, or the clear sense that much of the confrontation was absurd and vindictive, she refused to be cowed. She would not offer the contrition Kramer sought. Around them the courtroom hummed, the soft scrape of benches, the rustle of skirts, the low murmur of people taking sides. Some nodded at Kramer's urgency. Others exchanged uneasy glances at the spectacle of private lives dragged into the open. Kramer's method produced a corrosive intimacy. By narrowing the conversation to sexual behavior, he aimed not only to establish guilt, but to brand and unsettle. The more he returned to those themes, the more obvious it became that the trial was about control of bodies, reputations, and community standards, as much as about any literal pact with demons. Helena's wealth and influence did not protect her. If anything, they inflamed the situation, making her both a target and a temptation for those who wanted a scandal to be made into an example. The scene was intensely human. There were small, sensory moments. The electric pause when an accusation landed, the shuffle of feet, the low, determined steadiness of a woman who refused to be narrated away into a cautionary tale. Kramer worked like a plow through the soil of people's lives, insisting that sin take shape in certain recognizable confessions. For bystanders, the trial felt less like sober adjudication than a contest of force, the institutional zeal of an inquisitor against the personal defiance of a woman who would not bow. Throughout, Helena remained convinced that Kramer was bent on persecuting the innocent. That conviction colored everything she said and did. It explained why she refused to offer the scripted repentance he sought, and why she interpreted each question as another attempt to whip up hysteria in Innsbruck. Whether her stand sprang from politics, pride, or principle, she came to embody a wider tension. This was not merely a clash over alleged witchcraft, but a collision of wills, with the town itself caught in the middle. The struggle was loud and intimate, public and private at once. It left marks, a hush after explosive moments, friends and neighbors rearranged by suspicion, reputations frayed. What remains in the record reads less like a tidy chronicle than an echo, of sermons interrupted, of careful accusations turned into instruments of shame, of an interrogator who insisted on nursing one theme, sexual impropriety, until it filled the entire space. Helena Schuberin's story is therefore not simply the story of an accused woman, but of a community watching the thin line between justice and persecution being tested, and to many ears, breaking. Fortunately for Schuberin, Kramer's immediate superior, Bishop Georg Golzer, did not share his zeal. Over time, Golzer came to see Kramer's accusations as baseless and even a little unhinged. In 1486, the bishop lost patience. He shut down the trials and expelled Kramer from Innsbruck, putting an abrupt stop to the inquisitor's activities in that town. Kramer had been beaten back, but not by a single dramatic defeat so much as by the steady resistance of local institutions. In Innsbruck, the jurists and magistrates who guarded the routines of law and the fragile peace of town life refused to give him free rein. The doors he expected to open for investigations and accusations stayed stubbornly shut. Judges would not bend, and officials met his remonstrances with a cold procedural calm. Thwarted did not mean vanquished. It meant redirected. He could no longer knock on doors or drag suspects before courts that would not play along. Yet Kramer was a man of conviction in an age when ideas traveled in new ways. The printed word was becoming powerful, and where a magistrate's gavel could not follow, ink and paper could. So Kramer turned to print with the same intensity he had once applied to interrogation. He decided to gather his arguments, his theological proofs, and his bitter certainty about diabolic malice into a single, portable form. The result was a book meant to do the work he could not do in Innsbruck, to instruct, to persuade, and to standardize a way of thinking about witchcraft for judges, confessors, and inquisitors across regions. Published in 1487 under the stark Latin title Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, it bore the name of Jacob Sprenger alongside Kramer's own, a pairing intended to lend the work scholarly weight and a voice that reached beyond local disputes. There is something almost inevitable about that turn to books. When a door is barred, a determined man of words makes a door in paper. Kramer's manual was meant to be a hammer in more than name, a codified program of theological reasoning, legal argument, and the kinds of claims that had driven his campaigns. It was designed to travel further than any single pursuivant or summons, to teach prosecutors how to think and act where he could not. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487 thus marks a strategic shift rather than an end. If Innsbruck would not host Kramer's witch hunt, the printed page might. The title, the co-credit to Sprenger, and the date together stamped the book's purpose and its moment, a calculated, lasting intervention in the contested debates over witchcraft, law, and belief. In that move from courthouse to press, Kramer's stubbornness was transformed into something more durable. The man who had been shut out of one town's halls of justice now hoped that his published argument would shape other minds and other courts long after a single magistrate had closed a door against him. Kramer joined forces with another fanatical cleric, Jacob Sprenger, and their combined effort finally slipped from the press in 1487. Although both men are credited as co-authors, Kramer was clearly the principal driving force behind the book, a single mind pushing a single purpose into the world. By then, people across towns and countrysides already carried in their bones a stubborn conviction about witches. Fear and rumor had long traveled the roads. A sudden blight on a field, a neighbor's cow gone barren, a baby born blue and breathless, and communities stitched explanations together from scripture, folklore, and gossip. The Malleus Maleficarum did not invent those fears. It did something more dangerous. It gathered the wild, fearful fragments of popular imagination and the most extreme scholastic whispers into one hard-edged instrument, shaping scattered rumors into a cohesive account that made the most radical ideas about witchcraft sound less like hearsay and more like reasoned truth. Imagine a book that reads like a sermon in a courtroom at once. Sober Latin sentences lined with biblical citations, clinical theological argument, and vivid stories of diabolic pacts and unnatural harms. Its pages named the crimes as heresy, cataloged the methods, both real and imagined, by which harm was done, and spelled out procedures for interrogation and punishment. Where village accusations had been halting and contradictory, uncertain in law and theology, the Malleus offered neat categories and confident procedures. It taught priests, magistrates, and inquisitors how to turn suspicion into evidence, how to gather testimony that would hold in court, and how to interpret the most unsettling confessions. That transformation mattered. The book's tone, authoritative, meticulous, implacable, made extreme claims sound settled. Scattered anxieties became a map of enemies and signs, a practical guide to rooting out invisible conspiracies. Readers closed the covers not with comfort, but with permission. Permission to see malevolence everywhere. Permission to interrogate and punish with a kind of doctrinal certainty. In concentrating and arming belief, the Malleus did not so much create a new fear as turn an old one into a disciplined tool for action. The ideas it assembled were not new to many, but when placed together they acquired a force they had never possessed before. And the quiet, dangerous power of that synthesis reshaped how communities understood and fought the dark unknown.